Ma'am, I believe you indicated that this case came to you through a referral through a consortium of which you are a member. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you know who referred the case to the consortium?
I'm assuming that the defense attorneys made that referral. I believe it was at a professional meeting in San Diego.
Now, the diagram, which is, or excuse me, the chart which is on the board, which is exhibit, I think it's 295, which is entitled Psychological Maltreatment. Where do these categories, these 6 categories that you've been discussing in your testimony, come from?
Those 6 categories come from a consensus of the professionals, and it comes from the literature in terms of what is an operational definition of psychological maltreatment.
Okay, so it's your testimony then that these 6 categories are recognized in the literature dealing with psychological maltreatment.
Yes, they are.
As well-defined subcategories. Is
That's
that
correct.
Correct? Right. And I believe that you've indicated that, that it's maltreatment, correct, and not abuse? I mean, why is it you use the term maltreatment and not abuse?
It's a different name for abuse.
Okay. Now, any of those items, the 6 items which are listed there on that exhibit, are any of them the activities that the parents engage in to terrorize or isolate their children? Are any of those things reportable to the authorities for criminal prosecution?
Any of those things that a parent does to the child, are they reportable?
Yes.
Yes, indeed they are.
And is that in California?
That's, I would assume that every state in the union has, I wouldn't assume, I know that every state has a child abuse reporting law, and that it is against the law to hurt a child. It is I looked at the California, for instance, the categories there, and sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, those are all definable categories as
All right, so when you pointed out the fact that the Menendez family did not fully explore Eric Menendez's dysgraphia and didn't get him all the help they should have gotten him, that's something that's reportable to the authorities for prosecution?
well, if that's just a piece of the information that was not given. This was part of the pattern. And yes, as a matter of fact, under Public Law 94-142, if a parent does not follow through on educational recommendations, there are problems. A parent can be charged with neglect, educational neglect.
Is that in Utah?
That's national.
Well, you mean that's a federal statute? Is that what you're talking about?
Each state has their own abuse or their own laws regarding this, but yes, the 94-142 is federal.
Okay. And then if you talked about exploiting a child and wanting a child to fulfill the parents' fantasies or fulfill the parents' needs, so wanting your child to go to an Ivy League school, is that something that's reportable?
I think...
Well, is it or isn't it?
We're taking this out of context. I'm not talking about a child wanting their kid to go to an Ivy League school as being exploitive and having that be reportable as far as child abuse. I'm talking about that being part of a pattern of having the child fulfill a parent's needs. That was just a piece of the data that was given to me.
Now, you talked about taking things out of context, correct? You just use that term, right?
Yes.
Okay. The information that you got in order to prepare your evaluation was information you got from the defendants, correct?
Yes, it was.
The defense attorneys.
That's correct.
Okay. I believe you indicated that you read a lot of testimony in this case.
I did.
Did you read the people's testimony, the people's case in chief?
I read every bit of the testimony that has been sent to me and what you've put on here, yes.
All right. Do you know if you received the testimony of the officers who came to the crime scene?
Yes.
Did you receive the testimony of the coroner?
Yes.
Okay. And did you receive the testimony of Eric Menendez in its entirety, including his cross-examination?
I did.
Okay. And you believed everything that Eric Menendez said in his examination?
Objection, Your Honor. Improper question. Rephrase the question.
Did you believe to be true the facts as stated by Eric Menendez in his direct examination about the circumstances surrounding the killings of his parents?
Could I object to that line of question, Your Honor, since it's beyond the scope of this witness's testimony?
She based her opinion on it.
And I object to
All right,
arguing.
Rephrase the question, then
Okay.
proceed with that.
Ma'am, you based your opinion about whether or not Eric Menendez had been psychologically maltreated upon things that he told you in part. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And his ability to tell the truth was important in your evaluation as to whether or not these things actually occurred, correct?
That was a piece of it. But his ability to tell the truth about what happened to him as a child, his psychological maltreatment,
Yes.
well,
That was important
I
to
had
you.
most of that corroborated by other interviews,
Well, you
by
did-
other people, by extended family, by teachers, by coaches.
Okay, like the locking in the closet incidents, you had that corroborated?
No, that was Eric's testimony to me, that he had been locked into the closet.
And you found that to be very, very significant,
Well, I
didn't you?
believed it as part of his testimony that he had been psychologically maltreated. His perception was that he was locked in the closet. And as a matter of fact, I'm sorry, I do have corroboration of that specific statement. I think we have to be careful we don't take this piece by piece, because we look at the pattern. But yes, I do have corroboration for that particular one, because there was a letter, and I have seen the letter written by Mary Louise Menendez to her son Lyle regarding her brother, her son Eric, doing his homework in the closet. And then she made another comment about something about the little devil, and I had inquired what that little devil meant, and in fact, Eric told me that he didn't think that she meant he was the little devil. She was referring to the ferret that was also in the closet. So I do have, I've tried very hard to corroborate.
And one of the things that you did is you reviewed his testimony in court, correct?
Yes, I did.
And you reviewed not only his direct, but his cross-examination.
I did.
Okay. And after that, did you have any questions in your own mind as to whether or not he had told you the truth about everything when you talked to him?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the form of the question. They didn't cross-examine a bit.
Counsel, again, let's not argue the matter. The objection to the question.
Yes.
And legal objection.
I think it's calling for conclusion speculation by the witness.
All right. Rephrase the question in regards to the witness's state of mind and how she approached her task.
Is it important that the information that you base your opinion on be correct?
Yes, it is.
Is
As
it-
correct as possible.
Is it important that the conclusions you reach be based on facts?
Yes, but again, let's not just narrow it down. Let's talk about the totality of the picture. I'm assuming that all of the facts that I've been given, the data that I've been given from Eric, from Lyle, from the witnesses and all the things that I've read, I'm assuming that there's going to be error in that. There's going to be some distortion of memory. There may be some lying. But I look at the general picture. That's.
Now, are you aware of the fact that after the crime that Eric Menendez lied about his participation in it?
Yes, I am.
And you're aware of the fact that he lied to almost everybody who would sit still and listen,
I
correct?
object to the form of the question, Your Honor, assumes facts not in evidence and is argumentative.
Rephrase the question.
You're aware of the fact that Eric Menendez engaged in a pattern of lying to the authorities and to his family.
Object to the form of the question, Your Honor, it assumes facts not in evidence.
Objection
Lied to
overruled.
his family.
Objection overruled.
After the crime was committed. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes, I'm aware that Eric did not confess to the fact that he had been involved in this.
Well, not only did he not confess, but he diverted attention away from himself. It wasn't a failure to talk. It was the fact that he actually told people that other people had done it, correct?
Yes,
I'm going to object to the form of the question, it assumes facts not in evidence and is argumentative.
It is argumentative. Rephrase the question.
Be aware of the fact that at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, after he killed his parents, he was interviewed by a detective from the Beverly Hills Police Department.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And he was asked questions about his parents' killings and his whereabouts that night.
That's correct.
And you're aware that he lied to the authorities.
Yes, I'm aware of that. The
Did you-
fact that he lied about not having been involved in the killing of his parents doesn't mean that his whole life has been a lie and all the abuse is a lie. I think that that's stretching it.
But
I
is it-
think to take the fact that he lied about the crime to that he's lied about everything in his life is not fair.
Did you read his testimony where he said that the reason he went to San Diego to purchase shotguns was because he couldn't buy handguns at the Big Five sporting goods store in Santa Monica?
I read that.
Okay. Did you read the cross-examination wherein he was asked, isn't it true that that store has not sold handguns since 1986?
I'm going to object to this as beyond the scope. In these particular aspects, is beyond the scope of her testimony.
Objection overruled.
Did you read that portion of the cross-examination?
I did read that portion. That had nothing to do with what I was asked to do, which was evaluate if this child had suffered from abuse or not, and what the pattern of abuse in fact was.
But if the information that he told you was untrue, then how does that affect your opinion?
It doesn't affect my opinion.
So if information and facts you received from Eric Menendez were false, that doesn't change your opinion?
Eric had no reason to lie to me about his abuse. His coaches had no reason to lie. The teachers had no reason to lie. His family members had no reason to lie. So I depended upon that to form the basis of my opinion.
Wait. You're saying that Eric Menendez had no reason to tell you false stories of abuse. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that, yes, he had no reason to tell me false stories of abuse.
Are you familiar with this book I'm holding
I'm
up?
very familiar with that. That's our Diagnostic Statistical Manual,
Okay.
DSM-3R revised.
Are you familiar with the concept of malingering?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Your Honor, I'm going to, so you are familiar with this particular portion of the DSM-3, is that
Yes, I'm
correct?
familiar with malingering.
Okay. May I proceed? The essential feature of malingering is intentional production of false or grossly exaggerated physical or psychological symptoms motivated by external incentives, such as avoiding military conscription or duty, avoiding work, obtaining financial compensation, evading criminal prosecution, obtaining drugs, or securing better living conditions. Under some circumstances, malingering may represent adaptive behavior. For example, feigning illness.
I'm going to object to continuing to read this. I think it's improper if the witness knows what it is.
Right, how much longer is it?
Well, Your Honor, it's about half a page.
I'm going to
How
object.
much have you read?
I've read 2 paragraphs. I'm going to read the components of malingering.
I'm going to object to her reading it at all. If the witness is familiar with the components, there's no reason to read it.
Objection overruled. May continue.
Okay. It goes on to say, malingering should be strongly suspected if any combination of the following is noted. 1, medical legal context of presentation, e.g., the person's being referred by his or her attorney to the physician for examination. Eric Menendez was referred to you by his attorney, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Number 2, marked discrepancy between the person's claimed stress or disability and the objective findings. Number 3, lack of cooperation during the diagnostic evaluation and in complying with the prescribed treatment regimen, and 4, the presence of antisocial personality disorder. Now, did you consider the fact that Eric Menendez might be malingering in representing facts to you when you were...
I'm going to object to the form of the question, Your Honor. Malingering apparently has to do with representing symptoms.
All right, objection overruled.
Did you,
Question again?
did you consider the fact in your evaluation of Eric Menendez that he was malingering?
No, I didn't consider that in my evaluation because I had already been presented with a number of facts from other sources that Eric had been abused as a child and had that his parents were domineering, they were forceful, they were terrorizing, they had people in the community afraid of them, they had their own family afraid of them. They had all the qualities of abusive family. And when the stories that came out piece by piece, or the incidents that some of them were from Eric, some were from other members of the family, that didn't sound like malingering to me, it sounded like child abuse.
One of the things that you considered, though, was his father's treatment of him, correct? And one
Yes,
of the
his
things-
father's treatment
Yes,
of him.
and you also considered the sexual component of that, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Given the conference we just had.
Objection sustained. Go on to something else.
So it's your testimony that the fact that Eric Menendez lied to the authorities and lied to his family has no bearing on your opinion about whether or not he was abused, correct?
No, it has no bearing on my opinion that this child was, this boy, this young man as a child was abused.
Okay. Now, you understand that at the time that you saw him, he was not a child, correct?
What's your definition of a child, Counselor?
Well, I'm not the expert. What is a child?
Well, it depends on what you, chronologically, psychologically, emotionally, mentally.
Well, would you agree that nationwide 18 is recognized as the age of majority?
Well, I wouldn't agree because in some states it's 16, and I understand in Tennessee it's 12.
All right. Well, the general rule is that at 18 it's the age of majority. It's the age that we draft young men and send them to die for their country,
I'm
correct?
going to object. The form of the question is argumentative.
18 is the age at which we draft young men and send them to die for their
I'm
country.
going to object that we draft them to send them to
Counsel,
die.
objection.
Correct?
The draft age is 18.
Yes.
The draft age is 18.
Okay. When did you first examine Eric Menendez? What month and what year?
It was 1992, and I believe it was in March of 1992.
And prior to interviewing Eric Menendez for the first time in March of 1992, what information had you been given about this case?
Objection calls for hearsay.
Give me...
You're asking for the detail of the information?
No, I'm asking...
Nature of it.
Yeah, the nature, generically. Were you given police reports?
Prior to the time that I saw Eric?
Yes.
No, I was not. I don't believe so. Just a minute, let me think. I had a lot of information, police reports, pictures, family albums, school reports, medical reports, and I saw Eric in and around that same time. And I've been given information all along in the last year and a half.
And that information has all come from his attorneys, correct?
Well, from his attorneys, from the schools, from his coaches, from the family members, from friends. That's correct.
Aside from Eric Menendez, who else did you interview personally?
I personally interviewed Lyle Menendez.
Anybody else?
No, nobody else.
So everybody else from whom you got information to corroborate the defendant were reports that you were provided by the defense, is that correct?
Well, there were reports that were provided by the defense, but I think I need to tell you that I also consulted with other professionals who have been involved in the case who have had access to some of the individuals, who have interviewed some of the family members. And so I've had an opportunity to consult with other professionals in my field.
But as far as personal interviews that you have conducted in this case, it would be Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez,
That's
correct?
correct.
How much time did you spend with Lyle Menendez?
About 3 hours.
And what kinds of
that.
subject matters did you cover with him?
Objection calls for hearsay.
Just in general, is that the question?
Yes. What are the subject matters without the details? Were you talking about childhood experiences? Did you talk about the crime? What were you talking about?
We talked about the family system. We talked about what it was like to grow up with Jose Menendez and Mary Louise Menendez as parents, and what it was like to have a little brother like Eric.
So you were talking about interfamily relationships.
Interfamily relationships, I was.
Okay. Did you review any psychiatric records or psychological records of Eric Menendez?
I did.
And could you tell me which records you reviewed?
I reviewed, well, the most recent ones are the ones from the Lewis School. I reviewed his PDS records. I reviewed some of the early school records. I reviewed some testing on him that was done. I don't know who the psychologist was, but he'd had a WISCAR performed, which would indicate what his intellectual quotient was.
Do you recall the results of that?
Yes, he was in the above average range of intelligence.
Do you know what percentile he would have been in?
Probably about, it was not quite one standard deviation above the mean, I believe, so it would be not quite at the 84th percentile, maybe the 82nd percentile in terms of native ability.
Was that, were those records from Dr. Maloney?
I believe they were. He also did a number of other tests, and certainly would be the one to be able to give you the results of the other tests.
Did you give him any tests?
I didn't. I gave him some informal projectives. I had him draw a picture of a person. I had him draw a picture of the opposite sex of the person. I had him draw a picture of his family doing an activity, those kinds of things. I talked to him, did a moral judgment interview to see if what his thinking was, if he could determine right from wrong, if he had feelings of remorse, those kinds of things, informal kinds of interviewing techniques.
Okay, so you didn't...
Paper and pencil things, nothing standardized.
All right, so you didn't give him the MMPI test?
No, I did not.
Or did you look at the notes from Dr. Oziel in your evaluation?
I'm going to object to the form of the question as vague. What notes?
Did you look at any, did you listen to any tape recordings from Dr. Oziel?
No, I haven't had any of Dr. Oziel's tape recordings.
Were you aware of the fact that Eric Menendez was being treated by a psychologist at or near the time of his parents' death?
Yes, I was made aware of that in some of the information that I was given, and I also saw that on television in Salt Lake City, Utah, because Dr. Oziel was on TV.
Whatever you think of Dr. Oziel, don't you think that it was important to get a hold of his notes to decide if they had any value to it?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this and ask to approach.
All right, let's clarify something. You said you saw Dr. Oziel on TV?
I saw Dr. Oziel on TV. Well, he was on some talk show being interviewed by someone, and it didn't have anything to do with his treatment of this boy, and so it's not really relevant to this testimony. Only that I know that he treated Eric and that he has been on national TV.
Okay, so you were aware of the fact that Eric Menendez was being treated by a psychologist around the time of his parents'
Your Honor,
deaths.
I'm going to object to this line of questioning and ask to approach.
All right, you may do so. All right.
Were you provided with all of Dr. Oziel's notes of his sessions with Eric Menendez?
I was not.
Now, I believe you indicated yesterday that you've testified in court a number of times. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's on the issue of psychological maltreatment or other kinds of child abuse?
That's on child abuse generically.
Okay.
And this is considered part of that.
So when
If you'll remember, I said psychological maltreatment is believed to be the core issue of all kinds of maltreatment. Physical, sexual, emotional. It's what it does to the child. It's what the messages that it conveys to a child.
But in your testimony, you've testified basically to verbal maltreatment by the parents, correct?
In my testimony here,
Yeah,
I've talked about other things besides verbal. I've talked about the terrorization that occurred.
And neglect.
And neglect.
But we're
I've
not
talked about a variety of abuse.
Okay, but
beatings.
Now, have you ever, oh, let me ask you this. How much are you getting paid for your work in this case?
Your Honor, she's court appointed.
Overall,
$7.22, sorry. How much are you getting paid?
I'm getting paid $50 an hour for travel time and $100 an hour for my work.
And that's including your testimony?
That's including my testimony.
Okay, and how many hours have you put in on this case so far?
About 130. Plus, I haven't counted up the number of hours that I've spent here, nor the number of hours that I've spent within the last 10 days reading the transcripts of the trial. So there'll be considerably more by the time I tally up what it took to read those 12,600 or 13,000 pages.
All right, so that's only so far, excluding the trial testimony that you've read, correct?
Excluding the trial testimony and excluding the preparation time that I spent once the trial started. I've not tallied that up.
And part of your practice over the last several years, have you ever done evaluations of adult survivors or adult victims of child abuse?
Oh, yes, I have.
And you treat those people, correct?
I treat those people. I treat children and adults,
Okay.
survivors of sexual abuse.
I believe you also have done evaluations of entire families, correct?
That's correct.
And one of the things that's useful in evaluating an entire family is to talk to everyone in the family.
Well, I try to talk to as many people as are made available to me. Of course, in this case, the Menendez, I couldn't interview because they weren't alive to interview, but I interviewed as many, or read the transcripts of as many people who had known them in their life and had known about how they parented these kids. That was the information that I could get.
Don't you consider it valuable, though, in doing an evaluation to actually speak to the people who are alleged to be the abusers?
Well, sometimes it's valuable, but sometimes it isn't valuable. When I'm asked to do an evaluation of a child, I very often see only the child and see other members of the family if I can get information, but I'm not often asked to evaluate both the child and the perpetrator. No, that's not correct. Usually someone else evaluates the perpetrator. But my interest is looking at the child individually, intrapsychically, and then how that child relates to his system. Family system, community system, school system.
And if you're evaluating the child within the family system, as you did in this case, it is helpful, is it not, to talk to the parents?
I don't talk to the parents if it's a case of child abuse.
All right, so when is it that you do talk to the parents? In what situation would you evaluate the parents?
If I were asked to do a total family assessment, if the court wanted me to do a family assessment of, for instance, custody evaluations where there has been some problem, I of course, very definitely evaluate both parents. But in cases of psychological maltreatment, it depends on what the assignment is. In this particular assignment, I was asked to look at all the material that was given to me and to, as was the task force that looked at this case, and give an opinion on the likelihood of these children having been psychologically maltreated. That was what I was asked to do, and that's what I evaluated.
All right, so that was your sole function, was to see whether or not they had been
psychologically maltreated, and how that would impact specifically Eric's perception of life, of the messages that were conveyed to this child about who he was, how valuable he was, and was he on his own or an extension of a parent. Those are the kinds of things we look at in psychological maltreatment. That's part of the definition. Was he terrorized? Was he exploited? Was he isolated? Was he denied emotional responsiveness? Was he denied help when he needed it? Did he get the protection that he needed from a parent when he was hurt? Those are the kinds of things that I was asked to evaluate.
I believe you indicated that one of the things you found significant was that Eric Menendez had been denied medical attention and also educational attention to his specific problems during the course of his life. Is that correct?
Denied medical attention in that he, I know, has 2 scars which required suturing, and they were never sutured.
Did you have an opportunity to review his medical records, his pediatric medical records in this case?
I reviewed them.
Okay. Did you notice, for instance, did you review the medical records of the pediatric group which was located on Lucas Road in Princeton, New Jersey?
I can't remember what the specifics.
May I approach, please, Your Honor?
Yeah.
I'm going to show you a document and ask, this is one of the documents you were given by the defense attorneys in this case. This is a typed, these are doctor's notes which have been transcribed into typewriting so that they can be read. Do you recognize these somewhat indecipherable notes?
Well, that's what I was given.
All right.
Yeah, this is the first time I've seen this typed one.
Okay, now,
Transcription of office notes.
yes.
Hurt posterior pharynx. Now that I didn't realize that he had. Does it go into detail as to what the history of this was, how that happened?
Don't ask the
I
question.
have a
just
question
read it
for
if you
you.
want to.
Okay. Well, no, my question is, were you shown the notes from the pediatric group in Princeton, New Jersey by the defense?
I was the handwritten notes, but not this.
Okay.
But
All
now
right.
that I see this, I have some more questions about what happened to this child.
Well, when you say you have more questions about what happened to the child, are you telling me that you reviewed these notes, but you didn't notice them?
Well, as you can see, they're very difficult to read, and what I could pick up was that he had strep throat and he had a mole on a leg and so forth. But I didn't see this.
All right, let me ask you some questions. It appears that from these notes that he was taken to the doctor by someone in December of '77, in April of '78, in August of '78, in June of '78, in January of '79, August of 1980. It appears he's got 3 visits. He's got a visit.
Oh, I see what you're getting at. Well,
Someone took him to the doctor.
Yeah, well, I think Mrs. Menendez probably took him for, he had a lot of strep throat, and he had throat cultures, and those kinds of things.
Here he's got an infected, ingrown left great toe. This was on...
Oh, I'm aware of that because I remember Eric telling me that, as a matter of fact, that had to do with a very painful procedure, and he had steeled himself not to cry because he wanted his mother to report to his father that he had the procedure and that he was brave and hadn't cried, and he was very disappointed and hurt that that report wasn't made. Yes, I'm aware that mother took him to the doctor for those kinds of things.
Yeah, my question to you is not whether or not he cried at one of these procedures, but whether or not he was taken. These medical records indicate, especially from this pediatric group, that he was actually taken to the doctor by someone, correct? On many occasions.
He was taken to the doctor, as far as I can tell, for physical things. I don't know that he was ever taken to the doctor for psychological things.
Well, but he was taken to Dr. Oziel.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overall,
You are aware of the fact...
Taken to Dr. Oziel.
counsel, let's not...
You are aware of the fact that Eric Menendez was sent to Dr. Oziel.
I know that Eric went to Dr. Oziel. He told me about Dr. Oziel.
Okay, so you just said that you weren't aware that he was given psychological treatment, and yet you also are aware of the fact that he went to Dr. Oziel.
He went to Dr. Oziel, and I don't know about Dr. Oziel's tapes and Dr. Oziel's notes. All I know is that Eric was taken there because of some acting out, and Dr. Oziel had Eric sign something which allowed Dr. Oziel to tell the parents everything that Eric told him. That's about the extent of my knowledge of Dr. Oziel and psychological treatment.
Okay, that wasn't my question, but you are aware of the fact that he did receive psychological treatment, correct?
I'm going to object to the form of the question. It assumes facts not in evidence.
Overall.
Correct?
He went to Dr. Oziel for what? I'm not sure it was psychological treatment. I would have to see Dr. Oziel's notes and know what Dr. Oziel's diagnosis was and what the nature of the therapy was. And
But you weren't given those notes, right?
no, I was not given those notes, not been privy to Dr. Oziel's notes.
Now, you indicated that he had to go to see Dr. Oziel because of some acting out. Is that...
That was my understanding, that his parents were concerned that he was beginning to assert some of his independence, and they wanted help with that. Or I'm not sure what they wanted. That's...
Okay, what do you mean when you say assert his independence? You just used the term assert his independence. What do you mean by
Well, I'm
that?
aware that Eric had been involved in 2 neighborhood adolescent burglaries, or one with his brother and one with a friend,
And
at 2 of the neighborhood homes.
Do you know, what do you mean by an adolescent burglary? How is that different from...
He was with his brother on one occasion, and he was with a friend on one occasion, and he did this as an adolescent.
Were you aware of the value of the property that was taken in one of those?
I think that was worth a lot of money. There were some items that they took. I don't know specifically. I didn't pay a lot of attention to it because I placed it within the context of Eric's life and his age. And
So you didn't consider the fact that he took approximately $80,000 to $100,000?
I'm going to object to that, Your Honor.
Overall.
You didn't consider the fact that he took about $80,000 or $100,000 worth of property to be significant? You thought that was just like an adolescent prank?
well, it was an adolescent acting out behavior. Indeed, it was.
Well,
Certainly wasn't right.
Is there any reason that it wasn't criminal behavior?
Criminal behavior?
Yes.
Well, it was, I guess if he had been an adult, it would have been considered, what is that? You tell me, you're the lawyer, a felony? Is it considered?
Yes, it's residential burglary. It's considered
Residential
a
burglary?
serious felony in this state.
And he was underage, so I'm not sure. Was he charged, what he was charged with?
It's still a residential burglary. The punishment is different. Okay.
I'm going to object to that, John, giving legal advice. Juvenile
All
court is
right,
totally different.
again, just state your legal objection.
Well, it assumes facts not in evidence with improper
All right,
question.
the objection is sustained to the form of the question. It's argumentative. Rephrase the question.
So, ma'am, in considering the burglary and the grand theft in which he participated, in your own mind, you decided that that was something that was attributable not to his own volition, but something that just happened. Is that right?
Actually, what I attribute it to, if you want to know the honest truth, after I'd looked at the history of this child and the parenting of this child, I saw that as a plea for help. I often see this with children who have been in an abusive situation, and it's like, look, I've done this and nobody's responded. I've cried and nobody's responded. I don't do well in school and nobody's responded. Now I've got the attention, don't I? And that's an unconscious kind of a motivation, but I see this in kids. I see this in adolescents.
Were you aware that he purchased walkie-talkies before the crime to perfect the crime?
Objection, Your Honor. Assumes facts not in evidence, and I'd like to approach.
All right, you may do that.
Now, ma'am, were you aware of the fact that Eric Menendez indicated that he used money he had stolen in the first grand theft to purchase certain articles that he used in the second burglary? Were you aware of that?
Mrs. Pizanich,
My question is simple. Were you aware of that information? Yes or no?
I was asked to perform an evaluation if psychological maltreatment had occurred, and I performed that evaluation. Now, as far as these burglaries that occurred, I didn't go into all the detail on that. I was aware that they occurred, and I put that in the context of adolescent behavior and not as part of the psychological maltreatment evaluation.
Were you aware?
Go ahead.
Were you aware of the fact that some of the items taken included a grandfather clock, a Soloflex, and a computer? Were you aware of that?
I was aware that there were items taken, and I was also aware that they were items that the kids didn't need, they couldn't use, and I put it in that context that it was not something that they were going to try to sell to the pawn shop or make money off of, and it was not, this was not part of a pattern. This was not part of a child who throughout his life had been oppositional, had been defiant, had been in trouble. I couldn't find any record of any other trouble.
So a grand theft, a residential burglary, and killing his parents is not part of the pattern. Would that be your testimony?
That would be my testimony. That's not part of the pattern of having been psychologically, well, it is part of the pattern of having been psychologically maltreated, maybe if it comes to a breaking point.
Have you ever done any study of what percentage of the criminal population has been psychologically maltreated?
No, I think that's irrelevant.
Overall.
Have you ever done any studies, or are you aware of any studies that deal with the percentage of people who are criminals in the criminal justice system who've been psychologically maltreated?
I'm going to object to the use of the term criminal as being utterly meaningless.
Rephrase the question.
Have you ever seen or have you ever done any studies dealing with the percentage of people who've been adjudged criminals by a court by being found guilty or pleading guilty who were the victims of psychological maltreatment?
I'm going to object to that question as well. It's too vague and too broad, and no one is adjudged criminal. It's simply guilty or innocent.
Objection overruled. Do you understand the question?
Would you ask it again, please?
All right, let's have it read back.
Question, have you ever seen or have you done any studies dealing with the percentage of people who have been adjudged criminals by the court by being found guilty or pleading guilty who were the victims of psychological maltreatment?
No.
So you're not aware of any such studies?
No.
Would you assume?
Psychological maltreatment is a relatively new and discrete form of abuse. So I don't believe there are any studies, not to my knowledge.
In your expert opinion, would you say that most criminals probably have been psychologically maltreated?
Objection, Your Honor, that calls for speculation.
Let's phrase it another way. Do you have any opinions about that matter, one way or another?
About criminals being psychologically maltreated?
By their caregivers as children?
I don't have that information.
Do you have an opinion, though?
Do I have an opinion? I'd need more data. I'd need a lot more data. I'd need to know what happened to each and every one of those individuals in their life, what their parents were like.
I believe you indicated that one of the things you found significant is that Eric Menendez did not receive the educational care that he needed, correct? And that was based partly on the report that you received yesterday from the Lewis School?
By educational care, there had been recommendations made by teachers along the way to Mr. and Mrs. Menendez that had not been followed through on. That's what I meant.
But there were some things they did follow through on, weren't there?
Eric went to school when he wasn't playing tennis, or he was sent to school. His mother did his homework for him. Actually, she helped him quite a bit, if you call that help, in his later years in order for him to get good grades and to be able to get into college. I don't mean to minimize Eric's own ability, but he never really had an opportunity to show what he could do because it was done for him in those later years. I do know that.
Now, the report that you got yesterday was from a school called the Lewis School, correct?
Yes,
And
I've just had an opportunity to look at that yesterday.
And the Lewis School was not his regular high school, was it?
The Lewis School is a school that offers tutorial services and extensive psychological testing.
Right, and it's your understanding that he was found to have certain learning disorders by being diagnosed at the Lewis School, correct?
He was 15 and a half years old, so there are a couple of things of note here.
Wait, my question is, the Lewis School did in fact diagnose him as having certain disorders.
They were able to diagnose some mechanical problems in Eric's learning. They were not permitted to diagnose any psychological issues. They were not allowed to give him those tests.
But they
were allowed to give him tests that had to do with his ability to write and to read and perform math computation.
If the Menendez parents were not getting specialized treatment for Eric Menendez, then do you know how he found his way to the Lewis School?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained.
The Lewis School was not his regular high school, correct?
Asked and answered.
Overall.
Is that correct?
The Lewis School is a school that you can take a child to get help, tutorial kind of help, for remediation. And in that school, I read the letter yesterday, the Menendez allowed the school to give him a RAT, W-R-A-T, which is a test to see how the child performs. And he was allowed to be given that. He was not given further psychological testing, which would have been necessary. And it's surprising they went ahead and tutored him without that, all of that information. But they did, I think, do it for several weeks.
So
Tutored him,
gave
him some tutorial help in math.
So he did receive some tutorial help.
He had 3 weeks, I think.
Were you aware of the fact that when he was at Beverly Hills High School, he was also tutored by a private company?
Yes, he did have tutoring then, yes.
Okay, so it is...
Again, the emphasis was on performance, not why is this child not performing, but let's bring him up to speed so that he can be a good student. Performance orientation, again, part of the pattern.
So when you say that he was denied educational needs, he was not totally denied educational needs, was he?
He was given bits and pieces, of course he was.
Well, then,
you have to look at the whole picture, and that's what I keep coming back to, is it's a pattern.
may I approach, please? I'm going to show you some other records which have been provided to me by the defense.
I could use more water.
Let me ask, does anyone
take
need
a
a break?
break. I do.
Okay. We have one taker. Okay. All right, let's take a recess. We'll resume at 10 minutes after the hour. Everybody is here and we're ready to resume. Okay? You may continue your cross-examination.
You might want to pull the mic in front of you. Ma'am, in evaluating the facts of this case, did you by any chance interview their paternal grandmother, Eric Menendez's paternal grandmother? That is Maria Menendez.
No, I believe I gave you all of my sources.
Okay, so you didn't interview her,
I didn't
correct?
interview Maria Menendez.
Now, I believe before the break you indicated that you considered the grand theft and burglary that Eric Menendez committed to be acting out behavior or a cry for help. Is that correct?
Yes, I looked at it within the context of the boy's, Eric's behavior from childhood up. I looked at it to see if this was a pattern, and it was not. It appeared to be an adolescent kind of behavior.
In your mind, what is the difference between adolescent acting out and criminal behavior?
This was asked to me.
Overall. That's your question.
Adolescent acting out can be a variety of things. It can be stealing, it can be doing something to show, well, all adolescents act out, basically. There's a tremendous difference between adolescent acting out and criminal behavior.
But not all adolescent acting out is criminal behavior, correct?
Well, not all adolescent acting out is criminal behavior, no, but I'd be willing to say that all adolescents, at least most of the ones that I've worked with, do act out. And if they don't, then
right.
It's unusual.
One of the ways that adolescents act out is they'll wear clothes or a hairstyle that it particularly irritates their parents, right?
Well, again, it operates on a continuum. There are all different kinds of forms of,
Okay.
of adolescents showing their independence and doing things that they shouldn't be doing, certainly.
Do you think that dyeing your hair purple and shaving it off is the same as committing a burglary?
Objection, Your Honor, is irrelevant.
Overall.
I mean, do you think that's the
Argumentative.
Sustained. Form of the question.
Okay. Would you agree that there are degrees of adolescent acting out?
There are degrees of behavior, all kinds of behavior. I have no quarrel with that. I'm just saying that I viewed these burglaries that Eric was involved in as not a serious indicia that he was on his way to criminal behavior. I felt this was part of his adolescent period.
So you didn't think that he was on his way to criminal behavior? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that he was not on his way to criminal behavior. He was not going to con people. He was not going to be a con artist. I saw this, once again, as part of his adolescent period.
And
I did not see it. I can't make more of it. I can't make less of it.
So when he went to the police shortly after the death of his parents and he told the police a story about where he'd been that night, he was not acting as a con artist. Is that correct?
Sorry, I'm not following you.
Okay. You're aware of the fact that shortly after calling 911 that Eric went to the police station and told a story about what he'd done that night, which did not involve admitting he'd been involved in the crime.
That's correct.
Okay.
I'm aware of that.
And you're aware of the fact that he told several people that he had not been involved in the crime and in fact diverted attention to other people.
Objection, Your Honor, compound.
Overall.
You're aware of that, correct?
I object to the last part of the question as assuming facts not in evidence.
Overall.
State the question again, please.
You're aware of the fact that Eric told other people not only that he wasn't involved in the crime, but diverted attention to other potential suspects.
Again, I object that that assumes facts not in evidence.
Overall.
Do you understand my question?
No, I don't, because I don't understand what that has to do with where we were with psychological maltreatment.
You just said you didn't think he was on his way to becoming a con artist, and I'm asking you about instances in which he lied. Okay? Do you understand now?
Well, I understand that you're saying that Eric lied about where he was the night of...
Well, are you familiar with a transcript of a tape that was made on November the 29th of 1989 at a Gladstone's restaurant? Were you given that?
I may have been given it. I don't remember it. You could give it to me now and I'd refresh my memory, but, you know, I don't know what your question is.
Okay.
The Gladstone tape?
Are you aware of the fact that in late November of 1989, that Eric Menendez had a conversation with his friend Craig Signorelli, which was tape recorded by the Beverly Hills Police Department. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Okay. And are you aware of the fact that during that conversation, Eric Menendez told his friend Craig Signorelli that there were serious hitmen involved in the death of his parents?
Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to object to quoting that tape totally out of context.
Overruled. Your answer?
I heard about that, I believe it was day before yesterday, from Eric himself in this courtroom.
You heard about it because you either witnessed or read the cross-examination by Mr. Kuriyama of Mr. Menendez, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And in that particular conversation, he was, in fact, diverting attention away from himself as the killer onto others, correct?
Objection, Your Honor, that is argumentative.
Overruled.
Actually, the question doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Would you repeat it?
When Eric Menendez said that serious hitmen were involved in the death of his parents, he was not admitting that he'd done it himself, correct?
That's correct. And as I remember it,
That was my...
Could the witness answer the
Excuse me.
Well, she had, next question, please.
And in fact, by saying that serious hitmen were involved, he was elaborating on the lie, wasn't he?
he was trying to, as I understand it, as Eric described it, he was trying to get Craig Signorelli away from
the truth.
Well, or wanting to keep pushing him.
He was trying to keep Craig Signorelli away from the truth.
Objection argumentative.
Overruled.
Correct? I mean, the truth was he killed his parents, right?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
All right. And when he was talking to Craig Signorelli, he was not only denying involvement, but trying to say that hitmen had done the crime. Correct?
Objection argumentative.
Overruled.
I don't know. I don't know how you want me to answer this. I'm trying to answer to the best of my ability. I understand that what you're saying. I don't understand what this has to do
Well,
with.
regardless of whether it's a question you think should be asked, just if you understand the question, you should answer it.
Do you understand my question?
You asked me if I was aware that Eric lied. Yes, I'm aware that Eric lied.
Okay. Well, there are degrees of lying, wouldn't you agree? There's lying to protect yourself, and then there's other kinds of lying.
There's
right?
all kinds of lying.
Right. Okay. And you indicated that you felt that these crimes that he committed in Calabasas did not indicate that he was going to become a con man, correct?
I indicated that based on the history of this child, this boy, this adolescent, that the two burglaries that I knew about were not significant in terms of what was going to happen next. That's correct. I'm saying that this is a child who's been badly psychologically maltreated. That is the essence of my testimony.
Do you believe that he's a child sitting here today in court?
Again, I would have to ask you to define what you mean by child. I think that emotionally, yes. I think I see 30-year-olds, I see 40-year-olds who are emotionally children.
Do you think that excuses their conduct? Do you think the fact that children excuses?
I think that if you have lived in a family where you have been terrorized, you have been subjected to horrible things, you have had nobody to protect you, you have no one inside the family or outside the family to get help from, then I think you have been terribly maltreated.
And do you think that excuses?
Could the witness finish?
Had you finished your answer?
And I think that when you have been subjected to a life of terror and you live in a family with very powerful figures that everybody else is afraid of in the outside world, then you are boxed in. You are terrorized. You are afraid. And I think based on that kind of maltreatment, it's got to affect a child's emotions, a child's ability to organize, a child's behaviors. Everything that happens to us can affect us, and I think this is very significant.
Do you think it excuses criminal conduct? What is your personal belief? Do you think that that kind of...
Object, Your Honor. Her personal belief is not an issue here. She's here to testify to her expert opinion.
All right, you didn't object to this question when it was asked before. It's being asked now.
And I woke up. I'm objecting now.
Well, she gave a long answer, and now she's being asked the question again. And what is your answer?
Do you think it excuses criminal conduct?
I don't know what you're referring to as criminal conduct.
Killing your parents in a premeditated fashion.
I'm not aware that the killing of the parents was premeditated.
I'm asking you hypothetically.
Well, I'm going to object that it's irrelevant hypothetically.
Overruled.
Are you asking me if I think this child had a right?
No, I'm asking you hypothetically. Do you think that abused children should be excused from their conduct if they commit premeditated murders? That's what I'm asking you.
Ms. Bozanich, I think that that cannot be answered hypothetically. I think I would have to consider every single individual case. I would have to know as much as I could know about the treatment of this child.
All right, then in this particular case, do you think that the child abuse excuses criminal conduct?
I'm going to object to the form of the question, Your Honor. It assumes an ultimate fact that the jury has yet to decide, which is whether this was criminal conduct.
Did you want to restate the question, or do you want to pursue it as a statement?
I want to pursue it as a statement.
Objection overruled.
Did you understand my question?
I'm assuming that the jury is here to learn all they can learn about what we have to tell. And I'm assuming that they are the triers of fact, and they will make that determination. It is not for me. I am here to present what I know about the life of this boy.
Are you saying that you will not answer my question?
I'm saying I cannot answer your question because I think it's not right. I think that that is in the trier of fact needs to make that determination.
Would you say then that your personal experiences and your personal views have no bearing on the way you're testifying in this case?
I'm sorry, my personal views?
Yeah, your personal views on life.
I have tried to be very objective about this evaluation, as I do about all evaluations. I have tried to look at the data as it is presented to me. So I can't give you a personal view on this particular matter. I think that the facts will speak for themselves, and the jury will decide that.
All right, so you are not going to answer my question.
I'm going to object to this as argumentative, Your Honor, and cite Penal Code Section 29. It's an improper
Sustained.
question.
Objection sustained. Go on to your next question.
Now, I believe you indicated in your direct examination that one of the things that you found about Mrs. Menendez is that she denied medical needs to her son, Eric Menendez, and I'd like to approach and show you some medical records. May I approach, please, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'd like to ask you if you have seen this particular document that I'm showing you and the ensuing testing data.
Having some difficulty in Spanish, teacher thought he might have auditory processing problem. Yes, I'm aware of this. And he, in fact, had some testing and was, the family was informed that Eric, in fact, had an auditory processing problem, that his hearing was, the hearing acuity was all right. I'm not aware of any subsequent treatment, however, following the auditory processing, that when he was 13 and a half.
Well, I think you indicated that his processing was okay.
No, that misstates the testimony. She said hearing acuity is okay.
Okay,
His hearing acuity, I believe, was adjudged accurate. And I know that there was some actual degrading that went on of the child by his mother subsequent to that testing, in that she would say to Eric, "I know you can hear all right. What's wrong with you?"
The only question I just asked you was, were you aware of this report, right?
Objection argumentative.
Rephrase the question.
Ma'am, I just asked you if you were aware.
I object to the counsel referring to Dr. Tyler as ma'am as disrespectful.
All right, just objection overruled. You may ask your next question.
I just asked you if you were aware of that report.
I'm aware of that report.
All right. Now, you're not an advocate, is that correct?
An advocate?
An advocate for one side or the other.
That's correct.
Now, I'd like to ask you, have you looked at the medical reports here, which come under the heading of Dr. Jane Cheng, C-H-E-N-G. Did you review her medical reports of Eric Menendez?
I can't read these, of course, because it's illegible. And I read that he had diarrhea.
Okay, now,
Maybe you can interpret this for me. If you can read it, he had a cold and a cough and diarrhea and some childhood kinds of things.
well, it appears that he was taken to the doctor, and would you agree with me? He was taken to the doctor on the 9th of February of 1971, on the 12th of February of 71. He was taken on April 9th of 71, April 19th of 71, June 24th of 71, July 12th of 71,
I'm going to object to this as irrelevant.
Overruled.
August 27th of 71, the 29th of October of 71, the 7th of December of 71, and on and on and on.
Yes, I'm aware that...
Object to on and on and on, Your Honor, is an improper question.
All right. January 20th.
Well, why don't you just show it to her so she can see all the dates and see it?
It's irrelevant, actually, for my testimony.
Okay,
I am aware that...
Again, she just asked, did you see all those entries?
I did.
Okay, and it's irrelevant. What is irrelevant about the fact that Mrs. Menendez took her son to the doctor?
I know that Mrs. Menendez took her son to the doctor, and she took her son to get some testing. What I also know is that she did not appear to be interested in getting the help for Eric that he needed. For instance, with the auditory processing problem, it was diagnosed, and then because being labeled with a learning disability was not okay in this family. As a matter of fact, what's really I find quite ironic is that I see these problems that are identified with this child, but I find it unusual that the family, the outside family, knows nothing about it. Nobody else in the family outside of Kitty Menendez and Jose Menendez knew that Eric had a learning disability at any time. That was a surprise to them. Nobody knew that Eric was making, I think, straight fours, which is like a D, prior to the time that Kitty Menendez took him to the Lewis School to get some help to bring his math grade up. And that, so it appears as if this is a mother who cared about her child. I think this is a mother who cared about the image.
And that's why she took her son to the doctor for diarrhea? Because she cared about her image?
She took her son to the doctor for diarrhea because it probably didn't matter to her. I mean, that doesn't destroy a mother's image if your kid has diarrhea, but it apparently was very distasteful to her or embarrassing to her or dishonoring to her to have a child who wasn't perfect, a child who had a learning disability, a child who had problems with memory, those kinds of things. And what's really I guess was alarming to me when I looked at those records, that particularly those Lewis School records, that Mrs. Menendez was unwilling to have complete psychological battery done. And there, I don't have the information there, but and it's new to me, and you may want to read it aloud, but I thought it was quite amazing that the further psychological help was not given, because I think there was some information that I saw that would have been alarming and would have need to have followed through on.
Did you ever consider the possibility that Mr. and Mrs. Menendez did not tell other people about their child's disability so as not to embarrass the child? Did you ever even consider that? I'm just asking you, did you consider that?
That they didn't tell the family that their child had a learning disability?
So as not to embarrass
the child? I don't see that at all. I think they did not tell the family because there was this pattern of wanting to have a child who could perform, a child who did well in tennis, a child who did well in soccer, a child who could swim, a child who could make straight A's. And Eric couldn't do any of these, of course, but he had to lie to his relatives he was told to lie to his relatives about the grades he made.
You said Eric couldn't do any of those things. Actually, he was quite a good tennis player.
Eric could do all of those things. He could never do it to the perfection that the parents required.
Now, you were very critical of the fact that the Menendez parents did not get psychological testing for him after he was tested at the Lewis School.
Yes.
Okay. Did you ever consider the fact that maybe at that point in their lives, they didn't believe in the value of psychology? Did you consider that?
That's a possibility.
There are people like that in the world who don't see much value in psychology. Are you aware of that?
There are people, there are Christian Scientists who don't take their children to the doctors. Yes, I'm very aware of that.
Now, much of the information you got was from relatives of the defendants, correct?
I got my information from Eric, some from Lyle, from relatives, from friends of the family, business associates, coaches, and the records that were sent to me from the school, the teachers' reports. That is the source of my opinion on the psychological maltreatment.
Now, I believe that you indicated that you were asked yesterday if you could think of, I may have to say this wrong, and please excuse me, but something like you couldn't think of anything that Eric had told you or that you knew about that was good about Kitty Menendez. Now, that may be too large a paraphrase, but do you remember that? That you said, you thought for a while and you said you couldn't come up with anything positive about her?
Well, objection, that wasn't the question. It had to do with nurturing or support.
Again, let's not argue the matter.
Mistakes.
That's the question. You remember that?
Would you repeat the question? Can you ask it as you asked it yesterday, or are you asking a new question today?
Okay, I'll rephrase the question. I believe you indicated, for instance, that Mrs. Menendez had never intervened on Eric's behalf. I believe that was your testimony.
That was my testimony. In these cases where the child was terrorized or very, very frightened, there was no record of intervention, no record of nurturing, no record of holding, no record of taking care of this child emotionally.
I take it you did read or you did view his direct examination by Ms. Abramson when he testified here in court?
Yes.
Referring counsel to volume 96, page 16,092.
We don't have the transcript of this.
Oh, you probably memorized it, so that's okay.
No, actually, I didn't memorize it, but I'm not concerned about it either, so counsel can read.
Okay. I noticed there was a pause, though, after I made that remark. Took you lost for words.
I knew it was on
Okay.
16,000 such and such, but it just slipped my mind.
All right, you may proceed.
Question by Ms. Abramson at line 19. Were there times when you were young when your father was ridiculing or berating you, when your mother would say a word or two? Answer by Eric Menendez. When I was young? Question. Would she do that? Answer. Yes. Okay. Do you remember seeing that testimony?
I don't remember it, but, well, it obviously didn't impact me.
But you said...
She said yes. The question was, did your mother say anything? Oh, I do remember. Yes, I do remember. Eric said sometimes she would say, Jose.
Right, that was what I was going to reach.
That was the intervention.
Right. At page 16,093, the question, the testimony was that his mom would say Jose and he would just look at her and he would stop. He would stop. That was the testimony of Eric Menendez.
That Jose would stop?
Yes, Jose would stop his berating and ridiculing of Eric Menendez. Okay? So would you like to correct your recollection that you know of no times when she intervened on behalf of her son?
I think it's obvious that, just what I repeated, that at times when Eric was asked if his mother intervened, sometimes his mother would say, Jose, and Jose would stop ridiculing.
Okay, but yes,
if that's Eric's testimony, then it's Eric's testimony.
All right, so there
I was talking about the big things, I think. I was talking about, you know, the going into the cold bathtub when he was nightmaring, the real significant things.
I think actually what the testimony was is that he was sleepwalking and that she couldn't wake him up. I think that was the testimony.
Object, Your Honor, that misstates the testimony.
All right, without saying what you think the evidence is, you can ask a question.
Do you remember that, in fact, the cold water was applied in order to wake him up?
Yes, that's correct. He was having night terrors and would sleepwalk.
Correct. And that she used
But
the
it was
cold...
associated with night terrors. And she would use cold water. She would dunk him in it, and that was the way that she chose to wake up this child.
Okay. And you find fault with that, correct?
I find that, yes, I find that abusive.
Okay. You're aware of the fact that sometimes if people have too much to drink, they're thrown into a cold shower and it's turned on to them to wake them up.
I think that's irrelevant in this case. This child wasn't drinking. He was a baby.
And
he was having night terrors.
I'm not suggesting that he was drinking, but I'm saying...
So you're suggesting that, well, this would not be the way that I would address one of my child's night terrors. I would not put a child into a tub of cold water. I think most parents would agree with you, with me.
During his testimony, Eric Menendez testified that when he was younger, his mother seemed to care more about him than about Lyle. Do you remember
Yes,
that testimony?
I do
that he
remember
gave?
that.
Okay. So there must have been something good that happened while he was growing up.
Objection, I think that's calling for speculation.
Overall. But why don't you rephrase it so it's a question?
Okay. Was there, if in fact Eric Menendez made that statement, and in fact later on said one of the things he liked about his mother was her smile, would you deduce from that that he had seen his mother smile?
Eric saw his mother smile.
Okay, and would you deduce from the fact that he came to the conclusion that his mother cared more for him than Lyle, that she did something positive to him?
Oh no, I wouldn't conclude that at all. As a matter of fact, I would think that would be adding to the confusion in this child's life, that the mother wasn't equally caring for both of the children. And I think when you say, well,
And I say what? Are you finished with your answer?
I'm finished with my answer.
All right. Did you by any chance write a report in this case?
I did not.
Okay, is that your usual practice, not to write reports in cases where you're asked to evaluate people?
That is my usual practice. I take notes and I do an outline.
Oh, did you take notes?
I have my outline here.
All right. Would you provide that to the prosecution now that you've testified?
Yes. And I have the incidents that I recounted yesterday in the categories, and you can have all of that.
All right, thank you. Now, in the work that you've done and the literature that you've read, do you have an estimate of the percentage of the adult population which has been the victim of psychological abuse?
I don't have that estimate.
Okay. Now, I believe earlier I asked you about the criminal population. As to the general population, that is, like everybody in this room.
Are you talking about the general statistics that are becoming better known and better known about the incidence of sexual abuse? Is that what your question is?
No, my question was psychological abuse.
Well, psychological abuse is, with using this definition, is the core of any kind of abuse. And so we would have to talk about, we could talk about the very general statistics, which are quite well published, about sexual abuse. We could talk about different states. I don't have all those statistics. I do have the California state statistics in terms of sexual abuse, psychological or emotional abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. I do have those with me.
All right. It would be fair to say that children who have been sexually abused are also at the same time psychologically abused, correct?
Yes, that's correct. They've been exploited, certainly at the very least.
Correct. So there is a psychological component to sexual abuse, correct?
Yes, there's a psychological component to all kinds of abuse.
But not all psychologically abused children have been sexually abused, correct?
That's correct.
And not all psychologically abused children are physically abused, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
There are different forms of abuse, and it operates on a continuum, and probably most of us as parents could put ourselves someplace along the continuum by virtue of being a parent. I'm talking about the very significant end of the continuum where the abuse has been severe and ongoing, and there's not been intervention.
Just in terms of pure psychological abuse, have you seen worse cases than Eric Menendez's?
Have I seen worse cases than Eric Menendez?
Yes.
This is a pretty bad case.
Have you ever seen cases where children were locked in closets for years at a time and starved to half their normal weight?
I've read about those cases.
All right. Then, in terms of what you've read about, is this the worst case you've ever heard of?
Well, it depends. I mean, that's not a question that you can answer with a yes or a no. You have to take all of the data into consideration, and you have to look at what it has done over the years to the sense of this child of who he is and what he's worth.
And so in comparison to cases where maybe children have been locked in a closet inside their parents' home for 5 or 10 years and have never...
Most of those, the most severe cases, of course, are when the children die or when the children kill themselves. That sometimes happens too. And when it gets to the point of when a child has been terrorized and is so fearful and is so isolated and their choices are very limited, I do see children sometimes kill themselves.
Now, to your knowledge, Eric Menendez was never locked in a closet for years at a time, correct?
Eric Menendez was locked in a closet, and that is a piece of the pattern that I was talking about yesterday and today.
Eric Menendez was not locked in a closet for years at a time, is that correct?
Eric Menendez was not locked for years in a closet, not that I know of. That isn't a part of Eric Menendez's background.
Okay. He was not denied food, was he?
Well, he was forced to eat food that he had not wanted, and it was put in the garbage, and so he was fed. Eric was fed. He was clothed. He had a bed. He had the physical accoutrements that parents provide.
When a parent says to a child, "You're not leaving the dinner table till you eat your soup," do you consider that to be abuse?
Again, Ms. Bozanich, it's on a continuum.
If a parent always tells their child, "You're not going to leave the table till you finish your soup," is that abuse?
There is a difference between having your child take a bite of something or finish something and forcing the child until the child vomits. There's a big difference. So you can't compare the two. You're talking about parenting. And there are parents, I mean, all parents use those techniques. You need to stay at the table till you finish your soup.
Did you ever consider that any of the stories you were told were exaggerated in order to help Eric Menendez out of this bind that he's in?
Object to the former question.
Rephrase the question.
Did you ever consider that any of the reports of this abuse were exaggerated in order to aid the defendant?
I didn't find that there was any exaggeration. I found it to be corroborated by a number of people, the kinds of abuse that Eric had.
Well, but how do you know those number of people didn't get together beforehand?
Oh, I'm going to object to that, Your Honor. It's calling for speculation.
Overruled.
How do you know the people didn't get together beforehand? You don't, do you?
Well, there wouldn't be any way to know that there had been a meeting of the teachers and the coaches and the extended family and the people that have spoken here. There wouldn't be any way of knowing how, but I think that's highly improbable that there was ever a meeting of people saying, well, let's make up and exaggerate the facts of this boy's life.
Did you read Marta Cano's testimony from testifying here in this courtroom? Marta Cano.
Yes, I know who she is.
All right. Did you read the cross-examination that I did of her, wherein I asked her about lying?
I haven't had a chance to read the cross-examination of her.
Okay. If I were to tell you that Marta Cano indicated to me that she would lie for me, would that change your opinion as to the accuracy of the information you got from her?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the form of the question.
Sustained.
There was no way for you to test whether or not Mrs. Marta Cano was a person who told the truth, was there?
I was not asked to do any tests like that. It's impossible to know anyway. There isn't anybody that can tell you if somebody's telling the truth or lying.
And even a lie detector test doesn't
Even a lie
tell you that.
test doesn't
Right.
stand up in court.
So you as a psychologist and as an expert witness have no magic way of telling if someone's telling the truth or not?
Oh, no, of course not.
All right.
No one does.
So when you are given an evaluation to do, you have to rely.
I have to rely on the information that's given to me, and I have to look at the total picture, which is what I keep coming back to, because I think any of this in isolation needs to be put in a context, and that's what I rely upon.
And when you looked at the total picture of Eric Menendez, I believe you indicated that the fact that he lied did not have any impact on your findings.
I took it into consideration. I take all of this into consideration.
And what value did you give it?
What value did I give the fact that Eric lied?
Yes.
I didn't give it any value in terms of his psychological maltreatment, because that it didn't pertain to what was happening to him in the home.
And you didn't think the fact that he has lied on other occasions had any impact on the information he was giving you?
He appeared to be very congruent, very consistent, both internally with what he was telling me and then what I could corroborate from outside sources.
Where was he physically located when you interviewed him?
He was in the, first time was in the attorney's room.
He was in the Los Angeles County Jail, right?
Yes.
Did you think that that might be a motivating factor for why he talked to you?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Overruled.
And I'd object also that it's calling for speculation.
Overruled.
Did you consider the fact that he was incarcerated for first-degree capital murder to be a motivator in what he was telling you?
Well, I knew that he was in there for having been involved in the killing of his parents. I knew that.
Well,
And in terms of his motivation to tell me about some of the questions that I asked him, my sense, Eric told me, Eric answered questions I asked about his early childhood.
do you know whether or not he received any psychological treatment in the jail before you interviewed him in March of '92?
I believe Eric had some psychological treatment with Dr. Vickery.
Were you made privy to Dr. Vickery's notes in your evaluation of him?
No, I have not seen Dr. Vickery's notes.
Would you have been interested in seeing Dr. Vickery's notes?
I was more concerned, my job was to evaluate the likelihood that psychological maltreatment of this child had occurred.
Were you interested in knowing what Eric Menendez had told to Dr. Vickery?
About what? About the psychological maltreatment? About his parents' terrorization?
About any of those things?
About any of those things?
Were you interested?
I have not been given the notes. I'm assuming that there's, well, I know that there's a doctor-patient privilege, so I don't have any of those kinds of notes.
Right, so you were not provided with those notes?
No, I was
correct?
not provided with those notes.
And you did not ask for them?
I did not ask for them.
You were aware of the fact that Dr. Vickery is a psychiatrist?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I believe you indicated that one of the things that you consider to be a component of psychological maltreatment is isolation. And I believe you recounted several specific incidents which you believe tended to show isolating conduct on the part of the parents, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Did you consider the fact that Eric Menendez did have friends when he was growing up?
I knew that Eric had some friends when he was growing up, yes. I was talking about the kind of psychological isolation that occurred within this household.
All right, but isolation implies that the person is alone, correct?
Isolation implies that psychologically and emotionally they have been isolated, that they're unable to receive the kind of help that they need. And that's what I saw in this case. I saw severe isolation, both within the family and outside the family. I was very struck with the amount of secrecy that this family, and I think particularly Mrs. Menendez, kept. And that I consider to be very significantly isolating.
Well, the secrecy isolated her from other people, correct? Her being a secret keeper and being secretive isolates her from other people.
Well, it also isolates the child from knowing what's going on, too.
Now, were you aware of the fact that Eric Menendez was quite close to his cousin Andy Cano?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Let me see you at the sidebar just for a moment, Counsel, just scheduling issue. Okay.
One of the things that you mentioned that you felt was an psychological maltreatment was the fact that Eric Menendez was not allowed to choose his foods that he would eat, correct? I believe you used that term, choice of foods.
That's correct.
Okay. Do you think then that children should be allowed to pick which foods they eat? Is that what you're saying?
Well, again,
Why don't you move that, Mike?
I think it, yes, children should have some choice in what they put in their mouths.
If children want to eat Pop-Tarts and potato chips, do you think the parents should not intervene then?
I think this is irrelevant, Ms. Bozanich.
Well, I'm asking the questions. And so, unless there's an objection, you're not supposed to...
Okay, let's not argue with the witness, and if the witness would just respond to the question. All right.
Every parent knows that a steady diet of Pop-Tarts and, what did you say, potato chips is not a nutritious diet.
I believe you also indicated that Eric Menendez was not given a choice of what sports to play. Do you remember your testimony in that regard?
Yes.
Do you remember Eric Menendez's testimony that his father gave him a choice between soccer, swimming, and tennis, and that he picked tennis because his brother played it? Do you remember that
He
testimony?
picked tennis because his brother played it. I think that's the significant piece there.
But your testimony was that he was not given a choice of sports.
Objection, argumentative.
Is that a question?
But wasn't it your testimony that he was not given a choice of sports?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
I recall, sports to me means play. Even competitive sports, at least in my growing up, if it wasn't fun, we didn't do it. Sports in Eric's life were not fun. They weren't play. When he was asked, I did see that information that was given to us by the Lewis School just yesterday, and there was something Eric had to write about what is your hobby, I believe it was. Anyway, Eric wrote, I play tennis, but tennis isn't really my hobby. Tennis was Eric's job.
Dr. Tyler, my question to you was, do you remember that he was given a choice of 3 sports?
I don't remember that he was ever, a choice between swimming and soccer. Yes, and I remember that he didn't want to swim because the water would be cold. And I remember a lot of swimming incidents where he was held under to expand his lungs and for periods of time, which I checked off as being abusive. So the kinds of things that happened within those sports were abusive. I don't see that having a choice between swimming and tennis and soccer as being allowed to choose your sport. I didn't have any indication this child was ever asked, what do you want to do? Do you want to hang out after school and have a friend over to play? You want to make a tree house? Do you want to play marbles? Do you want to join a boys club? Do you want to go to Cubs? Do you want to go Boy Scouts? Do you want to go to a movie? I didn't see any of that. I saw, do you want to, play tennis? Do you want to?
Wasn't your testimony that Eric Menendez was not given a choice of sports?
I'm going to object. It's asked and answered.
It's not been answered.
Objection overruled.
That was your testimony yesterday, was it not, that Eric Menendez was not given a choice of sports? That's
My impression was that Eric was not given a choice of sports, that the sports were chosen for Eric.
And so if he was given a choice between swimming, soccer, and tennis, that was not a choice, correct?
That was not a choice.
Right. And because of that, the parents were abusive, correct?
This, again, is in the context of the kinds of choices they gave this child. You're double bound when you are asked which shirt do you want to wear, the striped or the plaid, and you choose the plaid, and then your mother says to you, so you didn't like the striped shirt. That's not giving a child choices.
I believe you indicated yesterday that in going through the 6 categories of psychological maltreatment, that Mrs. Menendez maltreated Eric Menendez from the age of 0 to 2. And one of the things that you cited, I believe, was the fact that she said, or you had a report that she didn't want to be pregnant. Is that correct?
There's some information from her, from the therapy notes that I have read, Mrs. Menendez therapy notes, that she viewed the boys as getting in her way of relationship with Jose, and that Jose had wanted more children and she hadn't really wanted any children.
But you have no reports from 1969 and 1970 when she was pregnant with Eric Menendez indicating at that time that she expressed dismay over her pregnancy, correct?
The only reports that I have is that there is a report that during that pregnancy she smoked and she drank alcohol. That's the only report that I have.
So are you
in terms
saying,
of how she took care of the pregnancy.
so in 1970, was 1970 before or after the Surgeon General's warning on cigarettes? Do you know?
Oh, I'm sure it was before.
So you're saying that because she smoked and drank in 1970 during her pregnancy, you have deduced that she did not want to be pregnant with Eric Menendez.
I'm saying that's all the information that I have regarding her pregnancy, and the other information I had is that she had reported that she had not wanted to have children, that it interfered with her. She had wanted to have a career, I believe, as it was either an actress or maybe a model. Something in that field, and that having the children interfered with her ability to proceed on her own, fulfilling her own course.
Then how was she abusive to Eric Menendez between the ages of 0 and 2 because of that wish?
He was not a wanted child. So he came into a lot of people have surprise children, and many people are delighted once they're here. But this child, as we talked about yesterday, was not nurtured in the way that parents nurture their children, in terms of holding, caressing, calling pet names, saying I love you, those kinds of things.
Now you never interviewed the grandmother, did you? And you never saw any interviews from her, did you?
I have not had access to the grandmother's interview.
And she is the only surviving grandparent of this defendant, correct?
I'm going to object to this as irrelevant.
Overall.
She's the only surviving grandparent, correct?
As far as I know, yes.
Well, you've done a fairly complete history of the family. You are aware of the fact that she's the only surviving grandparent.
That's correct.
Okay. Why didn't you ask to either speak to her or have her interviewed?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to that question. It's irrelevant.
Overall.
That information was not made available to me.
Did you ever think you might like to have that information?
If it was available,
Why didn't you ask for it?
But Your Honor, again, I'm going to object. It assumes facts, not in evidence, that there is such information.
Overall.
I didn't know that there was any interview. My understanding is that that grandmother did not wish to be involved in this case. Maybe that's an assumption that's erroneous, but I really don't have any information regarding that.
So you made no effort to either interview her or find out information from her to corroborate your assumptions, correct?
I didn't know how to reach her, and that isn't, I can't do that. I have to rely on the sources that give me the information to give me the information, make people available.
So in other words, your role is merely to receive evidence and not to request evidence, is that
I
correct?
requested all the evidence that was available.
And if something struck your fancy as something you might like to have, you just ignored it?
Well, Your Honor, I'm going to object to that as argumentative.
Rephrase the question.
During the course of your evaluation, Did you ever think it might be nice to interview the grandmother to see if she could shed any light on the information you had?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this, given the prosecution's objection to the intergenerational issue.
Overruled.
Do you remember my question?
You asked if it would be nice?
No, did you ever think to yourself, gee, I'd like to interview the grandmother and see if she could substantiate that Kitty didn't want to have Eric Menendez?
Asked the paternal grandmother if
Ye-
Kitty wanted to have?
Right.
No, I didn't think of that.
Okay. Did you ever think that she might be able to substantiate other claims of abuse within the Menendez family?
Possibly she could.
And why didn't you interview her then?
Your Honor, this
Because
has been asked and answered.
Overruled.
she wasn't available to me.
Did you ever call Ms. Abramson up and say, I want to talk to the grandmother, I think it would make my evaluation complete?
No, I did not.
Why not?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this as pure argument.
Overruled.
I've been told that the grandmother does not wish to be involved in this case. That's why she's not involved in the court, I would assume. And she has not testified.
So you decided not to interview her or have her interviewed for that reason, correct?
She was not available to me.
Now, could you explain to me how a child suffers abuse at age 0?
Do you want to go through what we went through yesterday?
No, that wasn't
in
my...
terms of the nurturance and...
No.
And
Are you saying that because Kitty Menendez didn't want to be pregnant, that feeling while she was pregnant was some sort of child abuse on her unborn fetus? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that that was the beginning of a lifetime of rejection, of degrading, of emotional non-responsiveness. That's what I'm saying. That was the beginning of this child's life. And that was all I was saying.
Now, the teachers and the coaches whose interviews you relied on were people who did not see the Menendez brothers inside of the family home. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
All right, the teachers did see the Menendez brothers inside of the home?
You said teachers and coaches, and
Okay. All right, let's
I
break
couldn't
it.
agree with you with coaches because I am aware that there were coaches who were familiar with the Menendez family homes and the Menendez family.
Okay, so there were some tennis coaches who had been inside the home on very discrete occasions, correct?
It's my understanding.
Yes, right. Now, as far as people who lived in the home every day, would you say those people would have a better idea of what went on in the home than people who were occasional visitors?
I'm going to object to this as vague as to time, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Okay. When, let's say the age between 0 and 2, would you say that people who were either lived in the home or involved in babysitting the Menendez brothers would have a better knowledge of what was going on in the home than, well, they didn't have tennis coaches at that time. So wouldn't you say that people who lived in the home while they were children would have a better knowledge of what went on in the home than the tennis coaches who occasionally visited?
Your Honor, I'm going to object again because it got, first it was
All
0
right,
to 2, then it
The
got
objection is
vague.
sustained as to the form of the question. Why don't you restate it?
Most of the information about the in-home abuse that you've cataloged comes from relatives. Would you agree with that?
It comes from Eric and it comes from relatives.
Right. And the coaches and the teachers deal mainly with activities of the Menendez parents outside the home, correct? Mainly.
Yes.
Okay.
And they also made comments, more meaningfully, I think, than that, is the comments that they had to make about the demeanor of Jose Menendez and Mary Louise Menendez and how their children were treated. So I think that says significant, that makes a statement about how the kids were treated. They didn't know what was going on behind closed doors.
That's correct.
Nobody, very few people knew about that. That was pretty secret.
And in order to substantiate what goes on behind closed doors, you have to rely on the accuracy of the information you're given, correct?
This has been asked and answered.
Overruled.
Correct?
You have to rely on all the data that you can get.
Okay. And in the case of something that goes on behind closed doors, the only data you can get are witnesses who saw what went on behind the closed doors, correct?
Are we getting into
No, you're the one that used the phrase behind closed doors.
behind closed doors?
Yes.
Secrets, you mean?
I'm saying that when the family was at home and they
Yes.
were conducting themselves as a family, and there were no tennis coaches involved and there were no teachers involved, wouldn't you agree that that's a different situation than how...
Well,
than
you
what,
bet. You bet. I think all kinds of things can happen behind closed doors when there aren't outside
Okay.
people seeing what's going on.
And so when you're saying that you've corroborated the information that you got, some of the information you got could not be corroborated by teachers and coaches, correct?
What information are you referring to?
What went on behind the closed doors of the Menendez household?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this because it's too vague, and I'm not sure which closed doors we're talking about.
All right, it does seem to be a little vague.
Okay. I'm not talking about sexual abuse per se. I'm talking about inter-family interaction. When mom and dad and Eric and Lyle sit down at the dinner table and eat. Okay? Now, when they go to bed at night, when they get up in the morning, I'm talking about family interaction. Okay? Coaches and teachers cannot substantiate those kinds of activities, correct?
Your Honor, this has been asked and answered.
Overall.
Correct?
Coaches and teachers don't live with the family.
That's my point. So, most of the information you got about what went on inside of the Menendez home came from the Menendez brothers.
Objection, Your Honor. There's been other witnesses.
Wait, just state your objection. What is it?
All right, misstates the witness's testimony.
Objection overruled.
Do you understand
I
the question?
heard what went on inside that home from Eric, and I heard what happened inside that home from Lyle, and I also heard other witnesses testify as to what happened inside that home.
And-
Friends and relatives, yes.
Now-
And when you say in the house, do you mean in the bedroom? Do you mean
No,
what
I
are you
just mean-
talking about?
I think I specified when they ate dinner together, when they got up in the morning and got ready for school, when they went to bed at night.
There were reports from, I think it was one of the female cousins who had stayed there, and she had reported on some incidents, and she had talked about Jose Menendez accusing his wife of poisoning the food, and then got everybody up from the dinner table and took them out to dinner, and whether there had been a problem with her threatening to poison, I couldn't find out from the information that was given me, but I know that there were other people who had talked about dinner and had talked about the ferrets under the bed, and had talked about the disorganization and the chaos and some of the uncleanliness that was in the home. So I am aware of
Dr.
some
Tyler,
of those.
I just asked you a yes or no question, and you answered it with a specific anecdote that you haven't previously relayed to this jury. Is there a reason that you did that?
Object was argumentative.
Sustained as to the form of the question.
Can you answer the question I just asked you, yes or no?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled. Do you remember the question? Do you remember the question?
You better repeat it.
My question
Do you
was...
remember the question?
Well, I'm having a tough time.
The reporter remembers the question, right?
I believe the question was that in order to substantiate what went on behind the closed doors of the Menendez house, you had to rely on people who lived in the house. Something to the, yes or no, you had to rely on them.
And others.
All right. Did you ever consider that those people weren't telling you the complete truth?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
Which people are you referring to?
The people that substantiated what went on behind closed doors. That group of people who were not teachers and coaches.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this because the witnesses testified she did not...
Okay, counsel, you tend to argue your objections and make speeches, so the objection is what?
The objection is it misstates the witness's testimony and assumes facts not in evidence.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
I'm going to go on to something else. I believe you indicated it was your belief that Kitty Menendez did not want to have Eric Menendez. She didn't want to be pregnant with him. Correct? This is foundational. Is that, do you remember that testimony in that regard?
Can I make my objection even if it's foundational?
Yeah, she's already answered that, so let's
Okay.
get to the ultimate question here.
Do you remember your testimony that Kitty Menendez wanted a girl?
Yes.
Okay. Doesn't that contradict your statement that Kitty Menendez didn't want to have a child?
No, it doesn't.
Okay. Why not?
Because she didn't want to have children in the first place, and when she got pregnant, she was hoping it was a girl.
But that's not unusual for women, is it?
Objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation.
Overruled.
It's not unusual for a woman to say, gosh, I'm pregnant, I didn't really want to be, but okay, I hope I have a girl, and to go on and be an okay mother. That's not unusual, is it?
Lots of women are disappointed that maybe they don't get to have a girl or a boy, but it doesn't mean that that they go on to abuse their children.
My question to you is, if Kitty Menendez wanted to have a girl, doesn't that negate your statement that she didn't want to be pregnant?
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled.
Argumentative.
Overruled.
Kitty Menendez did not want to have children because they interfered with what she wanted to do,
But
to
that's
have a
not-
career. When she got pregnant, she wanted to have a girl.
But that's something that you got from a psychological report from
That's
about
correct.
1987, which was 17 years out after Eric Menendez was born, correct?
That's correct. But it was the beginning of this pattern that we've talked about,
In 1987?
of not wanting to have a child, not being able to nurture a child, and seeing the child then as an extension of herself, as someone to fulfill her needs.
Now, the incidences that you've been told about by the coaches and the teachers and everything, and the relatives and the friends, those incidences.
Yes.
Okay. Did you consider the fact that there were times in the Menendez household when there was no abuse going on at all?
I didn't expect that abuse was going on 24 hours a day.
All right, so would it be your testimony as an expert that they were not abused continually 24 hours a day?
I don't know that.
Okay, but
I
you-
only know about the abuse that occurred.
Okay. Do you think it was abusive for Mrs. Menendez to take her children to the I think it was the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City? Was that abusive?
No, that was not abusive.
Was it abusive for the
Not
Menendez?
unless she drove recklessly and terrorized them.
Do you think it was abusive for Mrs. Menendez to take her children on vacation to the Cayman Islands?
Depending on what happened on that
It
vacation.
depends on whether she was money laundering when she was in the Cayman Islands, right?
Objection, Your Honor, I think that's disrespectful and
All right, it's argumentative. Ask her a
That
different
too.
question, please.
Dr. Tyler, do you think it was abusive for Kitty Menendez to take her children to the Cayman Islands on vacation? Do you think that was abusive?
I can't answer that with a yes or no. It was not abusive, the fact that she wanted to go on a vacation. It's not abusive, the fact that she took the children on a vacation. That's not... I don't understand
Well-
what else I can say about that.
That
Because
might-
I don't know what happened on that vacation, so I can't expound on that. I mean, I don't know if abuse occurred or not on that vacation.
Well, if abuse had occurred on the vacation, don't you think you would have heard about it by now? Don't you think you would have?
Maybe.
Okay, so can't you assume by the absence of a claim of abuse that that was just a regular old family vacation?
No, I can't assume that.
All right.
Because as a matter of fact, I think that there's some indication that there was abuse on at least one of those vacations, as a matter of fact. And in terms of the psychological, I can't get into that, but I think there was some other kind of abuse.
Did you ever consider that the information given to you by Ms. Abramson was information given to you to paint the parents in the worst possible light?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the inference of the question that the information came from me. I think that
Rephrase the
misstates
question.
testimony.
Did you ever consider that the information which was given to you by people other than the prosecution was information designed to paint the parents in the worst possible light? Did you ever consider that? That maybe you were getting a very one-sided picture?
I didn't get any other information than what was given to me.
Now, I believe you indicated that that Eric Menendez was not treated as well as his older brother, or he was these. I don't know what words you used.
Second-class citizen?
Okay. Are you aware of the British concept of the heir and the spare?
Your Honor, I think that's irrelevant.
Rephrase the question.
If Eric Menendez was treated as a second-class citizen, he also didn't have the pressure on him to perform that his older brother had, correct?
Eric had a tremendous amount of pressure to perform.
But in comparison to his brother, who was the heir, he didn't have the same kind of pressures, correct?
He may not have had the same kind of pressure, but he had an incredible amount of pressure of a different sort. Both boys were pressured extremely and excessively.
In your evaluation of Eric Menendez, did you ever diagnose him as having a specific psychological disorder or disease?
No, I did not.
And
I was not asked to give a diagnosis. I was not asked to do a complete psychological evaluation. I was not asked to administer tests and do projective testing.
did you ever suspect during the time, the 30 hours that you spent with him and the 1,270 other hours that you spent evaluating this case, did you ever suspect that he had a psychological disorder or disease?
I suspected that Eric was a highly, highly anxious boy. I suspected that Eric had been very depressed. I knew that he had been sad as a child, very sad, and cried a lot and was extremely sensitive. I knew all of those things about him. I never did see a diagnosis of childhood depression, childhood anxiety, and I think it would be interesting to do a workup retrospectively, but I was not asked to do that.
Now, being anxious and sad is not a psychological disorder or disease, correct?
Being anxious and sad, well, it depends on the impairment. It depends on if, a child who is depressed, a child who is suicidal, a child who expresses suicidal ideation is a child in trouble, and a child could be diagnosed with childhood depression.
All right, but being anxious and sad in and of themselves are not a psychological disorder or disease, are they?
In and of themselves, well, anxiety that precludes or impairs a person's ability to function is definitely a disorder because it disables the individual. And depression, which interferes with a child's ability to concentrate and to pay attention and to perform and to function normally, is diagnosable. That's what I'm saying.
But it's not a recognized disorder or disease.
Yes, it is. Childhood depression, childhood anxiety.
So you are of the opinion that he may have suffered from those disorders or diseases, is that correct? I said may have.
Well, I'm going to object to that as calling for speculation, and she wasn't asked to make that assessment.
Overall.
Eric was a very sad little boy, as described. He cried a lot. Eric had unexplained stomach aches. Eric had nightmares. Eric had a lot of symptoms. Eric would space out. That's a clinical pearl when you see a child who's spacey, who has problems staying with what's going on. And all of these things were brought to my attention vis-a-vis the reports from the teachers who had a lot of concern about this child's emotional makeup. They were very concerned about him. And that's all I can tell you, is that there was concern by people outside of the home about this little boy.
Your Honor, I have still quite a bit more to do. Can we break for the evening?
In regards to the case of People versus Eric Menendez, except for Ms. Morrissey, and we'll proceed without her this morning, at least for now. All the jurors are present. Good morning to everybody. And we're ready to resume. We have a witness on the witness stand. Would you state your name again for the record?
Yes, my name is Ann Tyler.
All right, I'll remind you you're still under oath. You may continue your cross-examination.
Thank you. Dr. Tyler, yesterday I believe there was some comment that you were court-appointed in this case. Do you remember the commentary from Ms. Abramson when I asked you a question about your compensation?
Your Honor, I think it's improper to ask him based on my statement, my
All right,
objection.
regardless of how it came out, you may ask the question
Thank you.
more specifically.
You are affiliated with the defense on this case, correct?
That's correct.
Overruled. The answer will stand.
And the funding for your fees is paid for by the state, correct?
I assume it is. They are.
And you understand that in some kinds of lawsuits, the judge will get an expert to help the court, and that would be a court expert. Do you understand that that occurs?
Yes,
Okay, but that's not your status in this case, is it?
that's right.
All right, so you are affiliated, in fact, with the defense and not with the judge, correct?
That's correct.
I believe you indicated yesterday that part of what you relied upon in making your evaluation were the notes of Mrs. Menendez's therapist, Dr. Summerfield.
In part, yes.
Okay, and did you consider all of Dr. Summerfield's notes?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and were you familiar with the fact that...
I'm going to object to that an offer of proof now.
Without what?
An offer of proof, I'd ask to approach. Or counsel finishes the question.
Are you going into the content of the notes?
Yes, I'll
All right.
certainly discuss it.
Okay. All right.
Tyler, you were provided with psychological records from Mrs. Menendez from Dr. Summerfield, Dr. Cox, and Dr. Emery. Is that correct?
I was.
And you were not provided with any other records for Eric Menendez. Is that correct?
I'm going to object before the question is made.
When you say any other records, what do you...
I'm sorry. You were not provided with any psychological records of Eric Menendez, correct?
Asked and answered.
Overall.
That's correct.
Have you ever heard of the Rosenhan study?
No, I haven't.
I believe you indicated that one of the things you found significant is that when Eric Menendez was still under the age of 2, that his parents went house hunting and left him behind. Do you remember your testimony in that regard?
Yes, I do.
And are you aware of the fact that Terry Baralt testified that the Menendezes returned early from that trip because of Eric's behavior while they were gone?
I don't recall that they returned early. I recall that there had been a lot of concern about getting the parents home because the child was inconsolable.
Well, if Mrs. Baralt did in fact testify that the Menendez parents returned early from the trip, would you still interpret that as being a non-nurturing thing to do?
I'm going to object, Your Honor. This states Mrs. Burrell.
Overall.
I don't know what Mrs. Baralt attested to on that. I know that the baby was inconsolable and had been for some time. I don't know if they returned a day early or what the situation was, but he was left for a long period of time.
If Mrs. Baralt testified that the Menendez parents returned earlier than scheduled from their trip, how would you interpret their behavior in that regard?
That they were responding to Mrs. Baralt's request.
And of course, we're not responding to the agony of their infant. Would that be your testimony?
I don't know that.
Now, are you suggesting that as a parent it is better to take your child on a house hunting trip than to leave the child behind when the child is under the age of 2?
I'm not suggesting that.
I believe you indicated that one of the forms of psychological maltreatment visited upon Eric Menendez was that he was isolated from other people. Do you remember your testimony in that regard?
That was
Okay.
my testimony.
Did you consider the fact that his brother was his friend?
His brother was his friend later on in life.
What do you mean by later on in life?
When they were little, they were pitted against each other. There was quite a bit of competition. They were taught to box, and I went over that yesterday, that kind of pressure.
Were you aware of the fact that they also competed to see who could brush their teeth the fastest and get into bed at night?
Yes, I remember that.
And did you consider that to be abusive behavior on the part of the parents?
No, I did not consider that abusive.
Were you aware of the fact that in addition to his brother, that Eric Menendez was close to his cousin, Andy Cano, who's been a witness in this case?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
You're aware of the fact that Mr. Charles Wadlington was also close to Eric Menendez during his teenage years?
I'm going to object to that, Your Honor. This states the testimony.
Overall.
Are you aware of that?
I'm aware that the coach was associated with Eric. Yes, I am.
Were you aware of Mr. Wadlington's testimony in this courtroom wherein he said that he felt at times that he was Eric Menendez's only friend?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And in spite of the presence of Lyle Menendez Andy Cano, Charles Wadlington, and others in Eric Menendez's life, is it still your testimony that he was isolated?
Object to the form of the question since we don't know who those others are.
Overall.
Repeat the question, please.
In spite of the fact that Eric Menendez had his older brother Lyle, his cousin Andy Cano, coach such as Charles Wadlington, and other family members such as his grandmother, his cousin Diane, and people like that in his life, is it still your testimony that he was isolated?
Yes, it is.
And the presence of his Aunt Terry living close by for most of his life, did you consider that?
Yes, I did.
And you found that in spite of that, he was still isolated, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I believe you indicated that you could not find any photographs of the Menendez family where Mrs. Menendez was cuddling or holding Eric Menendez. Do you remember?
Object. Misstates the testimony.
Rephrase the question.
Okay. I believe you indicated you could not find any photographs showing physical affection between Mrs. Menendez and Eric Menendez.
I didn't see any hugging.
You, did you make an independent search of the Menendez property for photographs?
No, I did not.
Were you aware of the fact that on the morning of August 21st of 1989, that the Menendez family home was turned over to the defendants by the Beverly Hills Police Department?
Yes, I am.
Were you aware of the fact that at the time that the Beverly Hills Police Department completed their crime scene analysis, they did not take any family photographs with them?
Rona, I'm going to object to the form of the question as it assumes objects, not an evidence. There's no evidence that there were photographs.
Overall.
Please restate the question.
Were you provided with copies of the Beverly Hills Police Department police reports in this case?
Yes, I was.
In addition to the police reports, did you get recovered property lists? That is, things that were taken from the home at the time that the crime scene was analyzed?
I probably did.
Okay.
Don't remember what was in them.
From your perusal of the Beverly Hills Police Department reports and the property reports, did you see anything that indicated that the Beverly Hills Police took family photographs with them when they left the house on the morning or early afternoon of the 21st of August?
I don't recall that.
Okay. Were you aware of the fact that in December of 1989, the Beverly Hills Police returned to the Menendez home and took a computer?
Yes.
Okay. And aside from that, do you have any reason to believe that Menendez family photographs are in possession of the police or the prosecution in this case?
Rona, I'm going to object to the question as calling for speculation on the part of the witness.
Who gave you the photographs for you to look at to see if you could find a photograph of Mrs. Menendez with her son Eric?
I looked through the family albums that were provided to me at Miss Abramson's office.
All right, so you never even went any place where, for instance, the grandmother was to look at family photographs in a family setting, correct?
Rona, I'm going to object to the form of the question as assumes facts, not an evidence.
Sustained.
So the photographs that you were provided with were provided by Ms. Abramson, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And this is the group of photographs from which you could not find the type described in your testimony, correct?
I didn't find any.
I believe you indicated in your testimony, and I may be misquoting you, so please correct me, that all children love their parents?
Yes.
When you say that, at what age are you speaking of? Are you talking about adult children? Are you talking about little children?
Children's parents are the only people that they know when they're born, and I think small children do love their parents and are continually wanting their approval. And I think particularly in this case, I know that Eric strove throughout his life to gain the approval of his mother and his father. Their love for him was very important to him.
Now, I believe you've indicated you've done about 10,000 hours of patient evaluation. Is that what?
Clinical hours.
Okay, and what are clinical hours?
Clinical hours is based on a 32 clinical hour week times the number of weeks in the year times the number of years that I've practiced.
Do some children hate their parents?
I haven't found children who express hatred for their parents.
And when we're speaking about children, what age group are you?
Some children don't like their parents.
Well, what about people who are, let's say, over the age of 18? who are technically children because they still have parents, but they're legally adults. Have you ever met anyone over the age of 18 who hated their parents?
I'm sure I have.
All right, so when you say all children love their parents, are you confining that to
Most children love their parents.
All right, so you're mending it to most children love their parents. Of the clinical hours that you spent interviewing the victims of child abuse, how many of those victims of child abuse have been charged with a criminal offense?
Would you repeat the question?
Of the hours that you've done doing evaluations of children who are victims of child abuse, how many of those children who are victims were also charged with a criminal offense?
None.
Is this the first time then? This case?
This is the first time? No,
Yeah.
this is the second time.
And the other case that you were involved with where the victim of child abuse was charged with an offense, what kind of offense was that victim charged with?
Trying to get away from the parent, and the child was hurt and the parent was hurt.
Are you talking about physically injured?
Yes.
And was there any murder involved?
No.
Okay. You indicated that, in your opinion, Eric Menendez loved his mother.
Yes.
Okay. Did you discuss with him whether or not he loved his mother when he shot her?
No, I didn't discuss that with him.
You indicated in your testimony that from your evaluation of his school records and some other records that Eric Menendez had some learning disabilities. Would that be a correct way of categorizing those things?
Yes.
Right. Were you aware of the grade point average that he ended up with when he completed high school?
It was good enough to get him into college. I don't recall what it was.
Okay, may I approach,
3
please,
point something.
Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm going to show you a document which Mark as the next exhibit. I have no idea. I think it's like
296.
All right.
What is it, one page?
It's a one-page document. No, not this one. I'm going to show you what appears to be a printout from UCLA.
Right,
And-
I've seen this.
All right, and it appears, and I've yellowed two items. One is the computed grade point average of 3.22, and then also his SAT scores, correct?
That's correct.
All right, and his grade point average is a 3.22, and his combined SAT scores was 1,110.
That's correct.
Okay, the verbal was 510 out of 800, right?
Correct.
And in the math was 600 out of 800,
Right.
correct? All right, now, I believe you indicated in your testimony that it was your understanding that Mrs. Menendez at least had helped her son on occasion, if not more than on occasion, with his schoolwork.
That's correct.
Okay. But you had no indication, did you, that Mrs. Menendez took his test for him at high school?
No, I had no indication that she took his test for him in high school. I did have some indication that there was a test that I believe it was Mr. Menendez took for Eric. It was a Spanish test.
Would that have been a take-home test?
No.
You mean Mr. Menendez went to the high school and sat in a little chair and filled out the
No,
test?
somehow he got hold of it. I'm not sure how that happened.
Now, as far as the SAT, you're familiar with the way in which a high school student takes an SAT exam?
Yes.
You go to a big auditorium and you check in and you take
Right.
the test.
Mhm.
You had no indication that either Mr. Menendez or Mrs. Menendez took his SAT test
No,
for him?
I don't have any indication of that.
I believe you indicated, and this part of your testimony I don't quite recall, but you were speaking of something to do with Dr. Oziel and information that Dr. Oziel had given to Eric Menendez's parents. Do you remember your testimony in that regard?
I remember saying that I am aware of the fact that there was some sort of a signed release that Eric's parents could have information that was revealed in the therapy sessions by Eric.
Okay, may I approach, please?
Yes.
I have your Exhibit 127. I'm going to show it to the witness. Is this the item that you just referred to in your testimony?
That's the item.
All right, and you were aware at the time that you saw this exhibit that this confidentiality release was to Mr. and Mrs. Menendez, referred to here as Jose and Kitty, and also to Gerald Shayla, referred to as my attorney, correct?
Correct.
You were also aware that the release was valid for a 1-month period of January 18th of '89 to February 18th of '89, correct?
Correct.
All right. Now, in your practice, is it unusual for a patient to sign a release so that you may discuss the patient with others?
Releases have very specific purposes. And when I get a patient to sign a release of information, it is always stated what the purpose is and what type of information will be released. In the case of an adolescent, I typically, the adolescent really doesn't have legal authority to sign a release, but I typically will talk about what I will reveal to the parents.
All right. Now, when you're talking, okay, so you're saying an adolescent doesn't have legal authority to sign a release, correct?
Correct.
Okay. An adult, someone 18 or older, has the authority to sign a release.
Correct.
Okay. At the time that this was signed, Eric Menendez was 18 years old.
Correct.
So he was not, in fact, an adolescent.
I consider 18-year-olds adolescents.
But the law doesn't.
I'm going to object to this as argumentative.
Rule.
The law considers 18-year-olds to be adults. Do you understand
I'm
that?
going to object the question is irrelevant to
Full rule.
time.
Full rule.
That's correct.
All right. So legally, Eric Menendez was entitled to enter into this particular document, correct?
That's correct.
You indicated that another form of terrorization by Mrs. Menendez was the fact that she had, in your opinion, left a suicide note for her son to find.
That's correct.
And part of the information you got about that was from Dr. Summerfield's notes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, did you ever consider the fact that Mrs. Menendez left that note not for some horrible purpose, but as a cry for help?
A cry for help from her son?
Yes. Did you consider the fact that it was a cry for help?
Yes, I did.
And you rejected that?
No, I didn't.
All right, but I believe in your testimony you did not categorize it as a cry for help. Rather, you categorized it as terrorizing behavior.
That's correct.
All right, and why is it terrorizing behavior and not a cry for help from Mrs. Menendez?
It was a terrorizing behavior for the child, for the adolescent, because there was nothing he could do. He couldn't be responsible for his mother's life, and it was terrorizing. It was vicious.
It was vicious on her part?
Yes, it was.
So have you rejected the notion that she was trying to get help?
From her son?
Yes.
No, I haven't rejected that notion. I'm just saying he was unable to help her.
But maybe she didn't know that. I mean, did you consider that? Maybe she thought he could help. Maybe she thought, for instance, that if he behaved differently, that she wouldn't feel so bad.
I object to the point of question.
All right, you have to phrase it in the form of a question. Replace it with-
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Did you consider the possibility that Mrs. Menendez was trying to alter behavior in her son by leaving
Yes, I
that
did.
note? Did you reject that idea?
No, I didn't.
Okay. But I believe your interpretation was that she was trying to do something vicious to her son, correct?
Yes.
And that is your interpretation of her conduct, correct?
Yes, it is.
A woman who you have not met.
That's correct.
You said one of the isolating effects of Mr. Menendez's behavior upon his son Eric is that there was this secret that Eric Menendez could not tell, and that secret isolated him, correct?
That's correct.
You are aware of the fact that he claims to have told his brother on 2 occasions and his cousin Andy on 3. Are you aware of that?
I'm going to object. That misstates the testimony.
Full rule.
What secret?
The secret about the molestation.
There were lots of secrets in that household.
All right, but when you were testifying about keeping secrets, are there other secrets you know about that Mr. Menendez told his son to keep quiet aside from the molestation?
It's the atmosphere of secrecy that I was talking about. And yes, I am aware that that particular secret was well guarded.
Well, are you aware of the fact that Eric Menendez told his cousin Andy during 3 separate conversations about what was going on with his father. At least that's what he says. Are you aware of
I'm
that?
going to object to the
Rephrase the
editorial
question.
remarks.
Are you aware that allegedly Eric
I'm going to
Menendez...
object to that form of the question as also argumentative.
Overruled.
Are you aware of the fact that allegedly Eric Menendez told his cousin Andy on 3 separate occasions over perhaps a 3 to 5 month period the secret with his father?
I'm aware that Eric alluded to the secret.
Well, he said his father, well, I don't want to use the words, but he was pretty graphic in his description. Wouldn't you agree?
I'm going to object to the form of the question as argumentative.
Overruled. You understand the question?
Say it again.
When Eric Menendez spoke to his cousin Andy Cano, he said something about his dick. Do you remember Mr. Cano's testimony in that regard?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and you consider that to be not very specific, is that correct?
It was not very specific. It was alluding to the nature of the abuse.
And are you aware of the fact that allegedly Eric Menendez told his brother Lyle about the alleged molestation shortly before his parents' deaths? Are you aware of that?
I am.
All right, so your testimony that he could not tell the secret is incorrect because he did tell the secret.
Yes, he did.
Objection argumentative.
Overruled. The answer will stand.
I believe you indicated in your testimony generically about child abuse victims that they don't tell unless there's some intervening event. Is that a correct statement of your testimony?
It's very typical for children not to tell.
Correct. But not all children keep it a secret, correct?
Not all children keep it a secret.
And you talked about the fact that some people never reveal until the perpetrator is dead, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. But child abuse prosecutions are instituted against live people all the time, correct?
That's correct.
We don't try dead people, right?
Yeah, I'm going to object to the form of the question as argumentative.
Rephrase the question.
So the fact that the perpetrator dies is not always the triggering event for a child to reveal child molestation. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Repeat the question.
The fact that a child molester dies is not the only reason that someone would feel safe or feel
No,
comfortable.
of course not. No.
All right. During the course of your analysis of the Menendez family, did you ever consider that the reports of the relatives were exaggerated in order to aid the defendant?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the form of the question as argumentative, and since that's not in evidence.
Overruled.
Did you ever consider that, ma'am?
No.
And did you ever consider that the fact that Eric Menendez had lied on several occasions would invalidate the material that he was giving you? Did you consider that?
Yes.
And you rejected it?
Yes.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Redirect examination.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Dr. Tyler, is it the norm or is it the exception for sexually molested children to talk about it?
It is the exception.
And in this particular case, it is your understanding, is it not, that Eric was sexually molested between the age of 6 and the age of 18?
That is correct.
And do you find any evidence that he went around blabbing about it?
I did not.
Now, with respect to the allusions that he made to his cousin Andy, was it your understanding that those allusions were made some 7 years after the molestation began?
That is correct.
And was it your understanding that in his talking to his cousin Andy that he was seeking help?
Yes.
Do you recall Eric's testimony that all he wanted from Andy was some understanding of whether what was going on was normal?
Yes.
Was he seeking Andy to turn his father in?
No.
Now, with respect to his brother Lyle, is it your understanding that he told his brother for the first time at a time of crisis in August of 1989?
Yes.
And based on your examination of the entire record, was that revelation to his brother the first time he ever sought help from the outside in coping with his father's molestation?
Yes.
Objection. Leading assumes facts not in evidence.
Sustained. The answer is stricken.
What is your understanding about what the first time is when Eric ever sought help from an outside person in coping with his father's molestation?
When he told his brother Lyle.
Now, in looking over the materials that you did you read the interviews of other relatives, other friends, other neighbors than those dozens of people who came and testified in court?
Yes, I did.
And did you receive from me an entire set, that big, of police reports and police interviews in this case?
Yes, I did.
And did you receive copies of police interviews of other people who claimed to know the Menendez family?
Yes.
And did you see any evidence in any of those materials that indicated that the group of the dozens of witnesses who came to court had a meeting somewhere and decided to make up their testimony?
No.
Did you see any evidence from any witnesses with interviews that indicated that the psychological maltreatment or the sexual maltreatment in fact didn't happen?
No.
Now, Mrs. Bozanich brought up this issue of Eric's lying. Are you aware of any information from any of those contacts with relatives or any of the testimony of the relatives that Eric lied to his relatives about the killing of his parents?
I'm not.
Do you see any evidence that he told them any stories about what he did that night or what happened?
No.
Do you see any evidence that any relative ever asked him if
No.
he had anything to do with the killing?
No.
Now, did you see any evidence that he confessed or voluntarily came up with the information that he had killed his parents?
No.
But do you see any evidence of lying to them? Of his lying to his relatives
No.
about this? Now, with respect to the police, you have read the transcripts and you have seen the transcripts of his interviews both on the night of the offense and in September of 1989, have you not?
Yes.
With respect to the night of the offense, Mrs. Bozanich asked you, did he lie to the police? What did he lie to the police about on the night of the offense?
Objection calls for a conclusion on the part of the witness.
Sustained.
Well, what has been proven in this courtroom to have been a lie from that transcript?
Objection calls for a factual and legal conclusion.
Sustained.
Well, Mrs. Bozanich asked you, did he lie to the police? And you said yes. What were you thinking about?
I remember he lied about going to see Batman.
Was there anything else that you were thinking of that you considered in that report a lie?
No.
Did the police, in that interview, to the best of your knowledge, ever ask him if he killed his parents?
No.
Did they ever ask him if he owned a shotgun?
No.
Did they ask him if he picked up shotgun shells?
No.
Did they ask him if he had blood on his clothes or even changed his clothes?
No.
Did they ask him if he washed his hands?
No.
Did they ask him if there was anything in his car?
No.
Now, with respect to the statement that he gave Detective Zoller in his Aunt Terry's house on September 17th, 1989, when you answered Mrs. Bozanich's question about lying, did you have in mind anything from that statement?
No.
In that statement, do you recall the police ever asking Eric if he was responsible for his parents' death?
No.
Or ever asking any of the questions that I just framed for you?
No.
Mrs. Bozanich asked you if there were other cases of psychological maltreatment where the parents did even worse things to the children. Are you familiar with such other cases?
Yes.
Are you familiar with really extreme cases of physical torture and physical abuse?
Yes, I am.
Are you familiar with cases of starvation of children?
Yes.
Are you familiar with cases where children are chained to beds and locked in rooms?
Yes.
Did Eric Menendez tell you that any of those extreme things happened to him?
No, he did not.
You were asked about exaggeration. Were the incidents that he was relating to you overblown? Did they sound exaggerated?
No, they
Call for
didn't.
a conclusion, move to strike.
Sustained, the answer is stricken.
Did you think that the information he was giving you was suspect because of the character of the anecdotes?
Yes.
You thought it was suspect?
Of the character of the anecdotes?
I mean, his information suspect.
No, of course not.
And do you believe that Eric Menendez possesses sufficient mental ability to have made up stories for you had he chosen to do so?
Yes.
Let's turn to this subject of malingering. Does malingering mean basically feigning illness or making up symptoms of illness?
Yes, it does.
During the 30 hours that you interviewed Eric, did he ever tell you he was sick, mentally or physically?
No.
Did he tell you he suffered from some mental illness?
No.
Did he describe for you symptoms of mental illness?
No, he didn't.
Did he tell you he was abused? I mean, did he use that word?
No, he didn't use the term abuse.
Did he say, I'm a poor abused child?
No.
In fact, Dr. Tyler, in your interviews with him, based on what he was saying, did he appear to believe that his family life was normal?
Yes, he did.
And can you recall what he said in that regard?
Director call for your strike.
It's offered for
Overall.
state of mind, Your Honor.
Overall.
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, what did he say in regard to allusions that the interaction between himself and his parents, apart from the sexual abuse, was normal?
He thought that his interaction with his parents was the way that other kids interacted with their parents.
Now, is that a common perception among abused kids?
Yes, it is. It's very common.
And how does the psychological community understand that perception? Why is it these children feel that their life is what happens to other kids?
Objection beyond scope.
Overall.
This speaks to the issue of the isolation, both within the family and from outside of the family, the power and the control, and the programming and the conditioning.
Is it your understanding, based on reading all the materials, that Eric Menendez very rarely, if ever, spent significant time in other kids' houses besides his relatives?
That's correct.
Is it your understanding that he rarely, if ever, slept over at other kids' houses?
That's correct.
And when you talk about isolation, does that have anything to do with a child's ability to experience how other families operate?
That's correct.
Now, Mrs. Bozanich raised the name of 3 people who she could point to as claiming to have been close to Eric Menendez between the ages of 0 and 18. Is that a lot of close personal contact for a
Objection
kid?
argumentative.
Overall.
No, it is not.
And what is it? What would 3 people that either think they're close to you or you think you're close to over the age of 0 to 18 mean?
I think that corroborates the fact that this child didn't have a lot of outside friends, and the ones that he had didn't know a lot about him.
And you were asked about his Aunt Terry. Based on your evaluation of Eric and of this family, are there reasons why you feel that he would not have told his Aunt Terry what her brother was doing to him?
Eric couldn't tell anybody what his father was doing to him.
Well, he told Andy at some point. My question had to do with telling an adult who was close to his father.
Well, the adults in Eric's life had control and they had power, and they ruled his world. Adults do rule the children's world.
With respect to Aunt Terry and other members of the family, did you, in reviewing the materials and listening to them testify, were you aware of how they treated Jose Menendez within that family?
He was treated as the #1 son. He was the I want to say the king, the Commodore. He was treated as all-powerful, all-knowing, bright.
Did he appear to be respected by his sisters and the rest of the family?
Yes, I believe he did.
Did Eric ever indicate to you in your talking to him that he thought, in fact, that the family knew what was happening to him and approved? Well, it's not calling for speculation. I want to know if it's offered a state of mind by my client.
You're asking, did he say that to this witness?
To this witness,
during
yes.
the interview?
Yes.
All right, it won't be received for the truth of the matter, just a state of mind of the defendant during the interview.
No, he did not.
Now, when an abused child reaches adolescence, is that the end of their desire to keep the secret a secret?
No.
Are there issues involving peers and how you appear to your peers that affect an adolescent's willingness to talk about embarrassing family secrets?
Yes.
Now, if you were to, do you understand that when Eric was in California and on the tennis teams, he had a lot of kids that he hung around with?
Yes.
Is it likely, given what you know about sexually molested and other abused children, that with a new group of friends, Eric would just start talking about how his father had been buggering him for years?
Oh, no.
Now, in addition to having all the police reports, did you also have all of the grand jury testimony of the prosecution witnesses?
I did.
You testified that you looked at photographs. Did I tell you what photographs to look at, Dr. Tyler?
No.
Did you look at numerous family albums in
I
my
did.
office? And did you see photographs in there of many family gatherings, Christmases, Thanksgivings, parties, those things?
Yes.
Did you see many photographs of the family on vacation and scenic photographs of pretty places?
Yes. Some.
Did you see school photographs of the children?
Yes.
And were there photographs of both parents with Eric and Lyle when Eric and Lyle were very, very young?
Yes.
And did you look at all of those photographs that you could find where Eric was quite young and with his mother?
Yes.
And did you see any photographs in which she appeared to be interacting with the child?
No.
Did you see, do you remember seeing any photographs of Jose Menendez with Lyle when Lyle was real small?
Yes.
Do you recall any of those where Mr. Menendez seems intensely focused on Lyle as a baby?
Yes, I do remember that.
Did you ever see such intense focus by Mrs. Menendez with either of the babies?
No, I did not.
Now, Mrs. Pizanich asked you about Mrs. Menendez leaving a suicide letter for her 16-year-old son as a cry for help. You recall that?
Yes, I recall
Is
that.
it your understanding that at the time Mrs. Menendez left that suicide letter, she was already in therapy?
Yes.
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Well, at the
Yes,
time,
stricken.
Eric Menendez found the letter in the fall of 1980, in about December, I think he testified, of 1986. She was seeing a Dr. Cox, wasn't she?
Yes.
Now, why is it, without using the word vicious, why is it a maltreatment for a supposedly suicidal, allegedly suicidal mother to leave a letter saying she's about to check out for her child to find? Why is that maltreatment?
Because, number one, the relationship, this is this child's mother.
What does that mean?
This child loves this mother, Number two,
Let me ask you something there. Do you think she would have left, if she wanted help, do you think she would have left a letter for a kid that she didn't think cared about her?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Well, you were asked by Mrs. Bozanich if she could have left the letter because she wanted his help. Remember
yes,
that question?
I remember that
Do
question.
you think a person would leave a letter seeking help from someone who just doesn't care about them?
No.
Okay, so where you're assuming, for your characterization, that Mary Louise Menendez knew that her son Eric loved her.
Yes.
And, okay, so knowing that her son loves her, she leaves this letter saying, I'm leaving.
That's correct.
Is it your understanding that this letter was addressed to Eric, or was this letter addressed to Jose Menendez, based on what you know?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Do you have any knowledge about who the letter was addressed to?
No.
All right. Go on then with your analysis of why it was vicious for this mother to leave this letter, or why it was maltreatment for her to leave this letter.
Well, there were several reasons. One, the relationship of the mother and the son.
Meaning the son
Meaning
would,
that the son cared for the mother.
and would get upset.
Very upset,
Okay.
frightened. And number two, throughout his life, he had been blamed for things that happened to his mother, and he took a lot of responsibility for those things.
And is that fair for a mother to blame a child for things in her life that the child had no control over?
That's
Objection
not,
calls for improper opinion.
Overall.
that's not fair. And then number three, at the time that this letter was left, Eric was very isolated. His brother was away, his father was away, and he was alone. And so there was no one that he could turn to. He did call his brother.
He called his brother when he found the letter. And as far as you know, the brother did offer help to the mother. Isn't
Yes,
that
that's
right?
correct.
Which she rejected.
That's correct.
And is that why you didn't consider this a cry for help, since she rejected help when offered?
That's correct.
Now, Mrs. Bozanich intimated that maybe she was doing this to change her son's behavior. Are you aware of any problematic behavior by Eric Menendez in the fall of 1986?
No?
Mrs. Bozanich suggested yesterday in a questioning that the Menendezes did not get remedial help for the son they expected to get A's from, who had learning disabilities, because they didn't want to embarrass him. Do you remember that question?
I remember that question.
Are you familiar with numerous incidents that were both testified to and reported in interview where Mr. or Mrs. Menendez embarrassed and humiliated Eric in public in front of other people?
Yes.
There seemed to be, based on the history of this family interaction, any reluctance on their part to ridicule, humiliate, or embarrass their children in public.
No.
When you do evaluations in trying to determine whether or not various forms of child abuse have occurred, is it common to have dozens upon dozens of corroborating witnesses?
Objection irrelevant.
Rephrase the question.
Okay. Have you done evaluations where there is no other witnesses to the abuse than the abused child?
Yes.
Irrelevant with the strike.
Overall, the answer will stand.
And have you, in some of those cases, based on what you're hearing from the child and your expertise, still been able to form the conclusion that the child was abused?
Yes.
You've indicated that in this particular case, apart from relying on what Eric told you, and by the way, in your interviews with Eric, when you're taking information from him, are you only interested in what he's saying, or are you also interested in how he's saying it, how he looks, how difficult it is to get the information out, all of those things.
All of those things.
Now, you said that in this case you were not, you had no concerns about accepting the information that Eric gave you as true because of the corroboration.
That's correct.
Does it also depend on the way in which he gave you the information, the type of information he gave you?
That's correct. The internal consistency.
When you talk about internal consistency, you analyzed this entire family as a system, did you not?
Correct.
And did you determine patterns of behavior by both the father towards Eric and the mother towards Eric?
Yes, I did.
Did you also determine patterns, although they changed, of behavior by Lyle Menendez towards Eric Menendez?
Yes, I did.
And when you talk about Eric's information being internally consistent, what do you, does that have any relationship to these established patterns of behavior that other witnesses gave you?
Yes.
About Mr. Menendez, for example, or Mrs. Menendez?
Yes.
How did the information that Eric was giving you compare to the information that other witnesses provided?
It was consistent.
Was it consistent with these patterns?
Yes.
Mrs. Bazanich showed you that Eric had what I think quite high scores on the SAT.
Yes.
What kind of effort, Dr. Tyler, do you think it takes for a kid with at least 3 serious learning disabilities to do that well on the SAT?
An incredible amount of effort.
And does that, the fact that he did well on the SAT, is that, does that demonstrate a particular trait that you saw in Eric over the course of his life?
Yes.
What is that you saw?
Eric tried, always tried to perform well in sports, tried to do well in school, he wanted to be accepted as a Menendez man, and that was the thing that I learned from interviewing him, and it was the Menendez, I call it the Menendez myth. It was talked about by relatives that there was a very, very high performance standard and an image that had to be met and maintained. The standard met, the image maintained, in order to be accepted in that family.
So from everything that you're familiar with, does it appear that Eric was a lazy kid or was he a hard worker?
It appeared that Eric worked very hard to achieve what he'd achieved.
Now, with respect to the SATs, are you aware of the fact that he also took those review courses for like a year before he took it?
I am.
Now, is it your understanding that a 3.2 was adequate to get one into the University of California system in 1989? Do you know whether it is or not?
I don't know that.
Do you think that Eric's talent at tennis, based on what you know from both him and other witnesses, contributed to the UC system accepting him?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
You're familiar with Eric's statement that he believes that his tennis prowess and his father's connections helped get him into UC?
I'm aware of that, yes.
In all the information you received, did you ever see any information leading you to believe that after the Lewis School evaluation, Eric ever got any remedial help for the dysnomia and the dyslexia and the other thing, the writing thing? Yeah, dysgraphia.
No, I didn't.
Are you familiar with the testimony of one of his teachers, in fact, that she even observed he had great difficulty in the physical act of writing?
Yes.
And that's dysgraphia, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, Mrs. Bazanich suggested that the by merely taking Eric to get this tutoring at the Lewis School, Mrs. Menendez was showing concern for her child's well-being, and you rejected that notion.
I did.
What, in your opinion, was Mrs. Menendez showing concern for in trying to get a few weeks of tutoring for Eric?
Objection calls for improper opinion.
Sustained.
Well, why do you reject that this was her effort that this was an expression of her concern for her child?
Well, I rejected that because this was a child who had been diagnosed with a learning disability, and he needed more than remediation. He needed to be helped on a long-term basis to work with the learning disabilities. And the fact that the school was not permitted to complete the psychological testing and examine other issues that might be impeding this child's ability to concentrate, etc. I felt that Mrs. Menendez's goal was to see that Eric became better at math.
Well, was she concerned about whether Eric was good at math or whether Eric got grades in math?
Whether
Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Based on your examination of the information from the school teachers and their testimony, did Mrs. Menendez ever seem to show any interest in what Eric was actually learning versus the grade he got?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Well, does that fact that based on the teacher's information that she never seemed interested in whether he learned but only the grade, is that one of the reasons you rejected the notion that she took him to this school for his benefit?
Objection improper opinion.
Sustained.
Well, Your Honor,
Objection sustained. Let's move on.
are you familiar with how well, first of all, are you aware that the Lewis School also was rebuffed in their efforts to refer Eric for remedial treatment? Or excuse me? Can I finish? Thank you. Or remediation, as you call it.
Objection sustained. The answer is stricken as hearsay.
Did you rely upon the fact in forming your opinion that Mrs. Menendez was not really interested in Eric's disabilities being addressed on the fact that the report from the Lewis School shows that they rejected all referrals for treatment?
Objection calls for hearsay.
As to the form of the question, objection sustained.
Are you familiar with what's in the Lewis School report concerning their desire to refer Eric for treatment?
yes,
And is what's contained in that report concerning the lack of referral for treatment something that you relied upon in forming your opinion, expressed to Mrs. Bozanich, that Mrs. Menendez did not take him to the Lewis School for his benefit?
yes,
And was that information that the parents refused referral?
yes,
Now, are you familiar with, or are you aware of Mrs. Menendez's behavior when she brought Eric to the Lewis School for his intake interview?
yes,
And was there anything about that behavior as reported by the head of the Lewis School that formed the basis for your opinion that she wasn't there to see that her child got help?
yes,
And what was it about her behavior that informed your opinion?
Objection calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Your Honor, it's not being offered.
Objection sustained. Let's move on to something else, counsel.
Are you aware of the testimony from teachers that Mrs. Menendez was very defensive and very hostile and very intimidating with them over the years?
Objection irrelevant calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Was there anything in the way the teachers talked about how Mrs. Menendez would present herself at school that leads you to believe that she denied Eric educational needs?
yes.
Objection calls for hearsay.
Objection sustained. The answer is stricken.
I'd like to be heard, Your Honor.
You may.
Dr. Tyler, you recall Mrs. Bozanich showed you one of the releases that Dr. Oziel said had been, it's actually a waiver of confidentiality.
Yes,
You were familiar with Dr. Oziel's testimony that that's not the only waiver of confidentiality that he had Eric sign?
yes,
That he also had Eric sign a waiver that did not include the attorney, just the parents?
yes,
Now, in your clinical practice, if you have an adolescent in treatment, okay, and in treatment because of what you believe is interfamily problems. Is it proper clinical practice to report to the parents what that child tells you in therapy?
No,
And why not?
because then the child has no way of ever trusting you as a clinician enough to be able to get at some of the substantive things that are going on in their lives that they need to deal with. And so you can never get established what we call a therapeutic alliance, a therapeutic relationship with a person unless they can trust you.
And are you going to get the truth from a patient who doesn't trust you?
Surgeon calls for speculation of proper treatment.
In your
You'll get the truth on superficial kinds of things that the adolescent can, or a person can trust you with, but they will be unwilling to bare their souls, so to speak.
When you were talking about getting releases from adolescent patients, is that a release so that you can tell their parents what's going on in their therapy?
No, that is not a release.
Do you do that? Do you get releases from adolescents so you can then go and tell their parents what's going on in the therapy?
No, I do not. I discuss the confidentiality issues at the very beginning with the parents and with the child, and so that the parents have an understanding of that if there's to be therapy done, the child must trust that he can talk about issues that are sacred to him.
And the parents must understand they're not going to be told.
That's correct.
Now, do you in your practice keep parents apprised that progress is being made? Or that there isn't progress being made?
Yes, and that's the initial interview also, is that we have an understanding of how treatment is to progress and what is the parent's expectation on this. I also have to talk about the two types of confidentiality that are not, that cannot be kept secret, and one, of course, is if someone is abusing a child, and the other is if someone is going to harm self or others.
Now, with respect to what you get, do you ever seek permission from your adolescent patients to tell their parents the secrets that they're telling you?
Do I ever seek the adolescent's permission to tell
these secrets that they're telling you?
If it's something, and this is decided at the beginning, at the front, at the initial interview with the child and the parents, that if it is something that I feel that the child needs to discuss with the parents or problem solve with the parents, that I will never do this without the child's permission.
Okay. I have nothing further on.
Any recross?
Just one question. Assuming you're going to be finished with the Menendez case in approximately 1 minute, what is the total amount of compensation that you're going to receive on this case?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to that. The question's been asked and answered.
Overall.
I don't know. I've kept my hours, but I don't know. I haven't figured out the number of hours I've been here.
Would it be in excess of $100,000?
Oh, goodness, no.
Well, how much are you expecting to receive in this case?
Your Honor, asked and answered.
Overall.
I have no idea. This is I'm not getting paid very much. I would make more money if I stayed home.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Yes, on that subject, did you agree to cut your usual rate for expert consultation in this case?
In less than half.
And do you make more money in your clinical practice than you're making being a witness in this case?
Yes, and I sleep better.
Nothing further.
All right, we'll be in recess until 11 o'clock, ladies and gentlemen. Don't discuss this matter with anyone. Don't form any